I thought Banter was a British thing.
You said like Banter. Hello, we're live. Welcome back to the O-Bro Show, a show where two O-Bros host a show, and that's your intro.
There we
Seth,
go.
you gotta eventually say the intro. You know, it can't just be me. I've got it down pat, but you gotta learn.
It's gotta be a special episode, all right? It's gonna confuse
for you to give the intro.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm 50% of the show, but I own 100% of the intros. Like that's not fair. Seth,
I own the good looks. All right.
Okay, fine, whatever. You can have that, I guess. I'll have the intros. You have the good looks. Today, Seth, we're joined by a special guest with a really interesting topic, at least for you and I, that we're going to learn from. We're going to learn a lot. I'm going to take notes if I can. You know, I'm ready to go. So it's like, why not? We're joined by Nathan Bozeman, who goes by the Epitome Ministry on YouTube and things like Twitter, or I guess formerly known as Twitter, now X. And he's going to be presenting on the reliability of the Gospels and different parts of Scripture. So we're super excited to be joined by him and kind of just discuss. We're going to be listening a lot and then also having open discussion. So I'm going to bring him up and he can introduce himself probably way better than I can. So we'll just bring him up to stage. Hello, Nathan. Welcome.
How's it going?
To the stream. That's good.
Seth and Josh, my new friends. How are you doing tonight?
Good. Really
We're on
good.
The frontier already. Let's go.
Yes. I'm excited.
Yes, friends of the stream.
I've been looking forward to this all week. This is going to be a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
Well, that's good. That's awesome. Do you want to give yourself a little intro, maybe a little background for those watching the stream and audience? Who are you? What are you passionate about? And why did you start making content related to Christianity on the interwebs?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, my name is Nathan. I run a small YouTube channel called The Epitome where I do apologetics. I typically defend the Gospels, and I do a little bit of Protestant versus Catholic stuff as well, because I'm kind of noticing a need right now for that. And I guess people like what I have to say on the topic, so I've kind of got dragged into that. You know, Gavin Ortland has a similar story. He says, like, I kind of accidentally became a Protestant apologist. That's kind of how it feels to me too. And I do Christian radio as my job. So if my voice sounds tired, that is why. I've been talking all day. So other than that, I'm really passionate about studying the gospel specifically. That's like my favorite thing to study in the Bible. And I have a lot of reasons to think they're reliable, and that's what I want to share with you guys tonight. So it's going to be fun.
Well, I just want to show that you already have a fan in the chat, Curious Christianity. He's cheering you on, so we're ready to go.
That's my buddy Adam. He just debated Kent Hovind last night on Young Earth Creationism.
I watched that. Yeah,
and I thought
really good debate. So I thought so too.
Yeah, so it was good.
I don't know. Without further ado, are there any preliminaries you want to go over, Seth? Any big questions you want to? Seth, you always have the big questions here on the O-Bro Show.
No, I think I gotta feel it out first.
I'm just playing. I like to put you on the spot to like set you up to not have anything. So it's good.
Set me up for failure, like a good brother.
Yeah, sorry. I'm gonna pull up. You have a presentation, Nathan. I'm gonna bring it up to stream so the viewers can see it. On the reliability of the Gospels. Now, I'm going to stop talking, and I'll let you lead. Obviously, Seth and I will engage with questions when our brains are not big enough to understand or comprehend a potential argument. So, looking forward to it.
Man, it's going to be great, and I am going to try my best to make it accessible to everyone. I do not want this to go over anyone's head. There are some kind of scholarly words in here, but I will break each concept and term down as needed. So and definitely interrupt me if something's like, whoa, what did you just say? Because I don't want anyone to be confused. So before I get into the first slide, I want to say that this presentation is going to try to tell you the external and internal reasons why I think the Gospels are reliable. And I want to flag one objection before I even start. What most scholars say today is that the Gospels were written by Greek-speaking individuals that we do not know who they are. They're anonymous, and They did not know Jesus. They did not know the apostles of Jesus. And in fact, they didn't even live in the Palestinian Jerusalem area that the gospel authors are from. And so I want to ask you, as this presentation goes, how much more likely it is that that is untrue than that it is. Because I think as we look at this evidence, we're going to see that that hypothesis is, I believe, genuinely absurd. And so let's get into it.
Love it.
So I have 4 arguments I'm going to go through tonight. 2 of these are going to be external to the scriptures, and then 2 of them are going to be internal evidences for their reliability. We're going to go over the external stuff first. We're going to begin with external attestation. This is going to be basically early Christians and early writers telling us who in fact wrote the Gospels. Then we're going to get into some external corroboration. This is simply going to be things outside of the scriptures themselves that corroborate the truth of certain stories within the Bible. Then we're going to get into some Paleyan arguments, and Paleyan it just refers to William Paley. He was an apologist that lived in the 1700s. I personally think he's the greatest apologist of all time. So when I say Paleyan argument, I just believe that these are just arguments from William Paley. Then internal markers of reliability. These are just some extra few considerations from within the text that let us know the Gospels are reliable. So let's begin with external corroboration. So this is a quote from Augustine. He's a church father. And basically, he was asked a question, how do we know who wrote the works of Hippocrates? Okay. And this is how he said that we could know that. Because there's a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? Now, this is important because Hippocrates, all of his works are anonymous internally, which means that they did not say in the text, like, hey, by the way, I'm Hippocrates and I'm writing this to you. Okay, so the reason this question was even brought up is because someone was, asking this question. Same thing with Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. Within their works, they do not identify themselves. Aristotle, if you go to Plato's work, The Republic, nowhere within the text are you going to see, hey, by the way, my name's Plato. I'm writing this. What's up? What's your boy? None of that's going on, right?
Yeah.
So the only way we know Plato wrote his works is because people who received his works told us, yeah, he wrote it. Okay. And so this is the same thing with the Gospels, with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Nowhere within the text themselves are you going to see Mark say, hi, I'm Mark, Matthew say, hi, I'm Matthew, etc. So that's why this is an important question, because the reason we know who wrote the Gospels is because of the external attestation to who wrote them. The people who received the writings themselves say, those were the guys that wrote it. Okay, and we're going to get into some examples. We're going to begin with Tertullian, and we're going to work our way back in time. And this is very early. This is only 2 centuries after Jesus lived. And this is important because some of those works we were just talking about a moment ago, Plato, a lot of the manuscripts that we have of Plato are from hundreds of years after he lived. And so we have much, much, much better attestation to gospel authorship than a lot of secular works that no one questions. Do you hear anyone questioning if Plato wrote City of God? Have you ever heard that in your entire life? Never once. Okay.
Yeah. No.
So anyways,
I was gonna say maybe on Reddit.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So here's Tertullian. I have 2 quotes from him. He says, the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels also, which we possess equally through their means and according to their usage. I mean the gospels of John and Matthew, whilst that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. For even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribe to Paul. And it may well seem that the works which disciples published belong to their masters. So basically what Tertullian is saying here is that we have Matthew and John, who are apostles themselves. We have Mark, who was Peter's interpreter. That's why Mark's gospel is authoritative, because it's Peter's testimony. And finally, Luke, his authority is attached to Paul because he was a traveling companion of Paul. Now, he says in another quote, we lay it down as our first position that the evangelical testament has apostles for its authors, to whom was assigned by the Lord himself this office of publishing the gospel of the apostles. So we see those that were disciples of Jesus, Matthew and John, first instill faith to us, while of apostolic men, so people who were related to the apostles, namely Peter and Paul, Luke and Matthew renew it afterwards. So then I just ask underneath here, what do we learn from Tertullian? The names of the 4 authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark is based on Peter's testimony because Mark was Peter's interpreter. Luke is linked to Paul's authority because Paul was his master. And finally, the content of the Gospels grounds the Christian faith. That's what he says at the end there, where he says, these are the first principles of the faith. Okay. And we also learn that, yeah.
Can I ask a question on that, Nathan?
Yeah.
Maybe one question or potential objection is like, why would Peter need an interpreter to write the gospel for himself? And why did Paul, who wrote so many other parts of the Bible as we know it, why did he need Luke to write the gospel? Can you maybe speak into that?
Yeah, great questions. So basically with Mark, Peter, it seems pretty plausible that he was not educated. Let's just put it that way. So when Peter needed someone to write down the teachings of the Lord or the teachings of Jesus, he had to have someone who was at least somewhat educated in Greek in order to write down the gospel, because the main language of the Roman Empire was Koine Greek. That was the common language. And so that's what Koine means. Koine means common. So when you hear the Gospels are written in Koine Greek, it was written in the language of the average person. And what's interesting about this, J. Warner Wallace points out that around the time of Jesus's ministry, the Roman Empire had just implemented a mailing system. So you could basically access the entire Roman Empire through mail. And so Jesus actually showed up at a really perfect time to spread the message to the whole world, because there was a mailing system. Pretty much everyone was owned by the Romans, and Koine Greek was the common language. So it was a great way to spread the message to the whole world. So that's just a response to people as well. This is something you didn't ask, but a lot of people say, why didn't Jesus show up today? And it's like, well, he actually picked a better time when like Koine Greek was common to so many people. Right. And then for Paul, so actually, interestingly enough, the Gospel of Luke is written to someone named Theophilus. And so if you see this in his prologue and in Acts, you see it as well, that he's writing to a specific person. So it's a personal letter. So we don't know why Luke specifically was requested. However, we know that Luke's authority is tied to Paul. So basically, in his prologue to chapter 1 of his gospel, he says, I've investigated everything thoroughly. I'm going to give you an account, and it's going to be very thorough. And that's how you can be sure of the things that you're hearing about Jesus. And so, we don't have a clear answer for why Luke wrote other than Paul, other than he's writing to Theophilus. So we can kind of assume that Theophilus maybe requested some information, and Luke was a trusted source. And he's actually, by many people, considered to be one of the greatest ancient historians ever. And so maybe Paul recognized his studiousness and picked him for that reason.
Yeah, that's really good.
All right, let's go to the next church father, Irenaeus of Lyon. He wrote around 180 AD. So we're getting closer and closer to the time of Jesus. He said, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple, and this word departure refers to their death. So after Peter and Paul were killed, Mark, the disciple, the interpreter of Peter, handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. So what do we learn? We learned, again, the same 4 names mentioned of authorship. Matthew wrote something in Hebrew as well. So this is interesting. Matthew wrote in Hebrew, and he wrote it in their own dialect. So he basically wrote his gospels for the Jewish people. And, this is something we actually see in Matthew's gospel, right? He's all the time saying like, and this happened to fulfill this prophecy. Like he's very clearly trying to tell the Jewish people, like the Messiah has come. Like, look at this dude. Like he was the Messiah. So this actually very well kind of corresponds with what we see in Matthew's gospel. And then Mark is once again tied to Peter's preaching, and Luke to Paul's authority. We got any questions here, or we want to move on?
I'm good.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Now we have the Muratorian fragment. So keep in mind, this is a fragment, so we don't have the whole thing. So it's cut off at the top. And the first words we see is the third book of the gospel, according to Luke, the well-known physician. Luke wrote in his own name in order after the ascension of Christ. And when Paul had associated him with himself as one studious of right. See, so Paul recognized Luke's studiousness, like I said a moment ago, and that's probably why he picked him. Nor did he see the Lord in the flesh. So we see Luke was not a disciple of Jesus during his lifetime. And he, according as he was able to accomplish it, began his narrative with the nativity of John. The fourth gospel is that of John, one of the disciples. When his fellow disciples and bishops entreated him, he said, "Fast ye now with me for the space of 3 days, and let us recount to each other whatever has been revealed to us." On the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should narrate all things in his own name as they called them to mind. So a lot of interesting stuff in this in this fragment rather. So Luke is, we see that he's studious, and that's probably why Paul picked him to write. We see that John wrote last of all, and he told people to fast. And then Andrew was with him, and Andrew told him, hey, you should narrate these things. And this is going to be important later, because kind of like Peter needed Mark to write down his gospel, it's probably the case that John was not educated as well. We actually see this in Acts, that Peter and John are recognized as uneducated men. And so John is narrating the gospel, meaning that he's not writing it with his hand. He's saying what should be written down, and then he has a scribe writing it down for him. And also, just a funny little fact, Andrew does not speak in any gospel except John. So it's kind of funny that Andrew's with John, and he's right there. Also, the Muratorian fragment in another spot mentions that Philip was there, and also Philip is the only time Philip speaks is also in John's gospel. So kind of interesting stuff there. So there are 4 gospels, though unfortunately the names of the first 2 have been lost on this fragment. We can safely assume, though, it was Matthew and Mark. I mean, it follows exactly what we see before this. Luke was a physician. This is the first time we see this. And this is in an earlier document. Remember, Tertullian didn't say this. Irenaeus didn't say this. So even before them, we're learning Luke was a physician, which will be important later. He was associated with Paul. His gospel also has the nativity scenes. It mentions up here that Luke's gospel has a nativity scene. That matches the one we have in our Bible. Kind of cool. Mm-hmm. John was asked to write his gospel by others. Andrew was involved. Interesting stuff. Now we're going to go to Justin Martyr and Tatian. So Justin Martyr was writing around 150 AD, and Tatian is around 180. So anything I mentioned by Justin Martyr, put that date on it. And for Tatian, put that date on it. All right. So Justin Martyr was one of the first Christian apologists. In his defenses of Christianity and other writings, he quotes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't quote from John. He also refers to the Gospels as the memoirs of the apostles. So again, we're going to flag that objection at the beginning that people say they're anonymous. So we're talking like about 120 years after Jesus. And he's saying these are the memoirs, which means the memories of the apostles. Is he treating these as anonymous documents? No. He knows who wrote them. He also, in this quote with his dialogue with Trypho, he shows us he knows who Mark's gospel is. And when it is said that he changed the name of one of the apostles of Peter, and when it was written in the memoirs of him, so the memoirs of Peter, right? To him that this happened, as well that he changed the names of the other 2 brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, I don't know how to say that, which means sons of thunder. So
what a nickname.
Right? So James and John have their names changed to sons of thunder. Justin Martyr tells us in his dialogue with Trypho that in the memoirs of Peter, this happens. And this is only mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. So this completely corroborates with everything we've read so far, that Mark is the interpreter of Peter, and it's his memoirs. Okay. So you see how consistent this is? It's like, and as we read in that first quote, it's unbroken, it's unanimous, and that's how we know who wrote Plato and Aristotle. It's like, this is how we know who wrote the Gospels, because of this right here. Now, Justin Martyr's follower, Tatian, he wrote a work called the Diatessaron, which means the harmony of 4. It's a harmony of our 4 Gospels, and it quotes all 4 of them. And so a lot of people want to say, well, Justin Martyr didn't quote from John. Well, his student literally writes a work that has all 4 Gospels. So anyways, so that's not going to work. Now we're going to get to our 1st century evidence or early 2nd century. It's debated about when these guys wrote. Some people say around 90 AD, and I've seen as late as like 120, 130. So I just put a range so people don't yell at me about it. So I tend to think the Didache is probably around 90 to 100 AD. And I think Papias probably wrote around 110. But I think the information he's getting is from earlier than that, if that makes sense. So the Didache quotes from Matthew's gospel on multiple occasions. And this is important because of the Didache is the teaching. So that word Didache means the teachings. And so it refers to the teachings of the apostles. And and Matthew's gospel was the most widespread in the early church. So basically, they took Matthew's gospel, probably sat down with it, and wrote down some teachings to pass around at churches. So that's essentially what this document seems to be. Now for Papias. Papias tells us about Matthew and Mark's authorship. He does say Matthew wrote in Hebrew as well, the teachings of the Lord, the logia of the Lord, and then those things were translated later. And then he tells us once again that Mark is Peter's interpreter, and he wrote down everything that Peter preached. I think I said basically everything that was down here. So any questions here?
Good stuff.
I don't think so.
All right, so that's our external attestation. So we can see from our evidence that we have an unbroken chain of evidence, which if we go back to that Augustine quote, we'll see it makes it unreasonable to question the authorship of the Gospels if you have an unbroken and unanimous chain of evidence. We have no evidence to the contrary. We have no attestation to the contrary. You can't find a single quote that would attribute any other name to any of these documents. It is always these four names to these four documents. And if you look at our manuscript evidence, we have never found, let's say, a Gospel of Luke with a different name on it, or a Gospel of Luke with even Mark's name on it, or vice versa. Like, it's never been found. We have no evidence to the contrary. And so this is important. We've actually only ever found one manuscript that doesn't have a title on it at all. And it was actually a common practice for scrolls to be like rolled up, and then they would put a tag on it. And so it's possible the title was on the tag. So that's what most people think. So that doesn't mean it didn't have a title, but either way, all of our evidence. So now we're going to get into external corroboration. So this is going to be things outside of the Bible that corroborate stories within the Bible. Okay, so first we're going to get into archaeological discoveries. We're going to first look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason the Dead Sea Scrolls are important is because it shows us that there are genuine prophecies about Jesus before his lifetime. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the Septuagint, because they are dated to the BCs, right? The before Common Era. So we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. I believe they're the Septuagint's dated to about 200 BC. And I want to say the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated to around the same time. I could be misremembering that, but they're both before the time of Jesus. And what do we have? We have the Great Isaiah Scroll. We have in the Septuagint, like the entire Old Testament translated, right? So we can see that these prophecies about Jesus existed before his lifetime. And so this is very interesting. So like in the book of Daniel, when it says that there is going to be a second temple built, and then the Messiah is going to come, and then the temple is going to be destroyed, and then the Messiah is going to be killed, and then the second temple is going to be destroyed. We can see, there was a second temple built, and then Jesus showed up, and then he was killed, and then the temple was destroyed. Interesting, right? So these things corroborate Jesus's ministry and resurrection, and the actual prophecies are there. So now we have my friend told me how to say this word. He speaks Hebrew. I forgot. So I'm going to say Yehohanan. So there was this man. He was a crucifixion victim, just like Jesus. And a lot of scholars today, they want to deny the burial of Jesus because in order to avoid the resurrection, they want to say they don't know where he was buried. They don't know the tomb. They don't know where he was. And so the crucifixion victims, they never got an honorable burial. This heel bone shows that this is not true. Yehohanan was crucified, and we found his bones in an ossuary. What an ossuary is it's a bone box. So basically, he was buried, and then later on, they got his bones and put them in a bone box, and it's been preserved for us. And so we can see very clearly that sometimes crucifixion victims were buried. Okay. There's the Pilate stone. Pontius Pilate dedicated a stone to Tiberius, and this is dated to the time that Jesus was Jesus's ministry, and it shows that he was the procurator, just like it says in the Bible. So we have this stone that corroborates Pontius Pilate held the office that the Bible says he held. All right, we have the Nazareth inscription. This one's a lot of fun. So this is a decree that basically put the death penalty on anyone who would move a body from a tomb. Okay, so if you look in Matthew 27, after the tomb is found empty, it says that the Jews said they stole his body. That's the story we're going to tell everyone. Okay. And then if you look in Justin Martyr's writings, one of the guys we mentioned earlier that was writing in 150 AD, he said that when he was commenting on Matthew, he said that rumor is still passed around today. So we have early attestation for both in Matthew and in Justin Martyr that this was a rumor that was passed around by the Jewish people that Jesus's body was stolen from the tomb. Okay. So let's think about what that corroborates for us. First of all, that he had a tomb. Second of all, that it was found empty because they're presupposing it was empty, saying it was stolen. And Matthew's testimony in Matthew, where the Jews said they're going to pass this rumor around, it actually was passed around. So,
wow, yeah,
this inscription is really cool to me. And then we have the Pool of Bethesda. And the reason I bring this one up is because so often the Gospels and the Bible in general, it's treated as guilty until proven innocent. And rather than innocent until proven guilty, like so many secular documents. And the reason I say this is because there is a long time in scholarship where people said that John made up the Pool of Bethesda. It doesn't exist. We haven't found it. And then they did. And it has 5 porticos, just like he said. And so this is just an obvious thing that we should look for, that there is a lot of bias in some circles of scholarship. Let's just put it that way. So any questions here? Any comments? I'm going to drink some tea.
I don't know where I heard this. Now, I could have just heard this from like an internet atheist, so it's very possible that it was just complete bias. But were the Dead Sea Scrolls also found with possible like fraudulent documents, I guess?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is a great question. So a lot of people want to bring this up and say, oh, well, this means that like the Jewish people had a lot of extra books. However, what we know about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they were in a community called the Qumran community, and they were actually a heterodox Jewish community. They were not considered Orthodox Jews. And so the fact that they have non-Orthodox documents is not surprising. So that's a short answer for you. But yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's one of the most important archaeological finds of all time. Like it proves prophecy in the Old Testament. So often people used to say Isaiah 53 was written after Jesus's life. It's too clear that this is about Jesus. And then now we have the Isaiah scroll, and it's like, well, what do you say now? I mean, it's there. So very cool stuff. All right, let's go to a little bit more of external corroboration. This is where I'm going to have to explain a word that's big. All right, this is a big scholarly word. It's called onomastic congruence. All this means is that the use of names in the Gospels are congruent or similar to the way that names were used in the Palestinian area in the 1st century. So let me break this down. Basically, there was a study done by a Jewish scholar, and all she did was she looked at basically every document we have from around the 1st century. I want to say she did like 100 BC to 100 AD. I'm pretty sure that's correct. And she looked at all the names that were used in literature and in bone boxes, those ossuaries we were talking about, and every other instance, archaeology, whatever. And then she just basically made a list and a database of all these names. And then a scholar named Richard Bauckham came along, and in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he basically took this database of names and was like, hey, let me compare this to the Gospels and see like how, if the names are similar, like the percentage of names that were around the time. And as it turns out, they have really high onomastic congruence. So, for example, the most common name in that time for a Jewish man is Simon. And in the Gospels, the most common name is Simon. We have Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the son of Rufus. We have all these different Simons. And the most common name for Mary, or the most common name for women, is Mary, right? And we have like 5 different women named Mary in the Gospels. And for men, I think I remember the top 5 names. It's like Jesus, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and one other one. I'm forgetting the 5th one. But it's like all the names we recognize from the Bible, right? And so the Gospels have really high onomastic congruence. And then there's a scholar recently named Luke Vanderway. He did some work on this, and he compared this to the works of Josephus and the like other historical works to see like how do other historians fare in onomastic congruence. And the Gospels have the highest onomastic congruence of any ancient document at the time. And so as it turns out, this was just how the names were distributed back then. And this is kind of the thing that you would expect if they're writing real history. So the second external corroboration, this one is really fun. So I love this little connection because it's what we might call an undesigned coincidence, which we'll get into that later. But this is an undesigned coincidence with something outside of the Bible. So I have this question: is Bethsaida a city or a village? Okay. And the reason I ask this question is because Matthew, Luke, and John call Bethsaida a city, but the Gospel of Mark calls it a village. And so this question shows up: is Bethsaida a city or a village? Well, as it turns out, Josephus tells us that Bethsaida was upgraded from a village to a city around the time of Jesus's ministry. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the reason this is important is because of which gospel calls it a village. So again, the gospel that calls it a village is Mark, which, if we remember from our earlier notes, that is Peter's memoirs, right? Those are Peter's memories, Peter's teachings. And if we look in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, we'll see that Peter is from Bethsaida. Okay. So, that's interesting. So we have Peter preaching, a guy who's from Bethsaida. He's calling this a village, even though by the time Mark is writing his gospel, it's a city. So what is probably happening here is Peter is referring to his hometown as a village like it was when he was a kid. And then you have Matthew, Luke, and John calling it a city as it was at the time. So this is just like a really cool, this is like another one of those things where you can see that Peter is in fact behind the Gospel of Mark. This is like a little thing that shows Peter is actually the guy behind this gospel. And this actually shows a little random historical nugget in Josephus that Bethsaida was upgraded from a village to a city. And that's corroborated in the Gospels itself. So a really cool little nugget there. And the last one, Jesus tells the Pharisees in Matthew 23, verse 23, he's like yelling at them. He's like, "You blind guides, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but you neglect the weightier things of the law." First of all, I love the little pun there. He's like, you tithe all these light things that weigh nothing, and you're neglecting the weightier things like justice and mercy and love. And so Jesus was a punny guy. But the cool thing about this is actually in the Talmud, we learn that they have regulations for how to tithe spices. And so we actually know from history that this is something they did. And so Jesus is yelling at them for something that the Jewish people actually did at the time. So again, I want to ask you guys, let's go back to the hypothesis that the Gospels are written by guys that were not from Palestine, guys that were Greek speakers, were not familiar with the Jewish customs, did not know Jesus, did not know the area. Are you going to tell me that can explain this, that the names are this high in onomastic congruence, higher than Josephus, who himself is a Jew? Are you going to tell me that this little nugget about Mark is going to be there if Peter's not the author, or not behind the, rather, Mark's the author? Are you going to tell me that Jesus is going to say something that lines up so well with Jewish customs? And these are random Greek speakers. Come on now. Okay, let's keep going. One little additional external corroboration. We have two here. And these are both also from William Paley, by the way. So William Paley had a lot of good arguments. Again, I think he's the best apologist of all time. So I'm just going to say that. All right, so number one, there are celebrations of the resurrection that go back to the first century. Christians worship on Sunday. We have baptism, and then we have the Eucharist. Okay, this is important because let me ask you guys this. Tomorrow, if I were to be like, all right, guys, let's go celebrate. And you guys said, okay, celebrate what? And I said, let's celebrate the fact that I hit 500 home runs at the Brave Stadium yesterday. Are we celebrating that? It didn't happen, right? We're not going to celebrate it, right? And so, yes. And I dare anyone listening to this to go try to get people to celebrate something that didn't happen and have it go on for 2,000 years. Because guess what? Baptism, the Eucharist, and worship on Sunday still exists. Okay. And so this is important. So we're having people celebrating an event because look at what all of them point to. The Jewish Sabbath was on Saturday. Okay. This is why Jesus' tomb was found empty on Sunday, because he was killed on Friday. The Sabbath started at like 7 p.m., I believe, on Friday night. They had to quickly bury him. They didn't have time to anoint him. And then they're like, all right, the Sabbath is starting. We got to stop working. Let's go back home, and we'll come back on Sunday. And the women come back and anoint him, and the tomb is empty. On Sunday, that's why we worship on Sunday, because that's when the tomb was found empty. Okay? The baptism, Paul tells us that in baptism, we're united with Christ in his death and resurrection. It's a celebration of the event. The Eucharist, his body and his blood. Think about this. If it was just a celebration of his death, that doesn't make any sense unless the resurrection happened. Okay? Because otherwise it's not a celebration feast, right? It's only
Right.
His death is only celebratory because he rose. Otherwise it would have just been like the greatest defeat ever. It's like, oh, they killed him. Like, this sucks. But it's a victorious thing because he rose. Okay? So this is really cool. So yeah, I challenge anyone watching this, go try to get someone to celebrate something that didn't happen and have it continue for 2,000 years. Ask people how Kwanzaa's doing. All right, so let's go to the second one. The earliest opponents to Christianity, like Celsus, never questioned the validity of the authorship of the Gospels, even though he questioned authorship on other books like the Book of Daniel. So this is important because we have even the earliest enemies of Christianity assuming traditional authorship. Okay. And he was prone to question authorship of biblical books, and he didn't. So that tells us something. There's good reason to believe that these guys actually wrote the gospel. So that's just another little nugget right there.
Can I,
Oh yeah.
on the first one that you had there, Nathan, with, because the argument, celebrating it for 2,000 years, and this, I don't want to derail this conversation, so hopefully this is related, but can you speak into maybe like why maybe some of those celebrations are diluted in some Christian circles? Or is, because I can see like some refute would be like, well, not all Christians even agree on how to celebrate these things for 2,000 years. So maybe that's proof of that celebration not being, it's just based in tradition or something like that.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. So do you mean like some believe baptism saves, other believe it's a symbol and stuff like that?
Yeah. And even just like, not even necessarily because there's disagreements on that issue, but like if you were coming externally, you would maybe say, well, that's proof that this is that because Christians don't agree on that's diluting the celebration that is a central point to their faith. I don't know. I feel like there's some objection there that a critic or skeptic could have that, well, to the 2,000 years point, Christians celebrate this very differently in many different ways.
All right. So there's a book right here. It's called Leslie's Short and Easy Method with the Deist. It's literally like really short, like 40 pages short. Okay. And basically he's a historian, and he's basically giving criterion for how we can know a historical event happened. And one of his criterion is that there's a celebration of an event and it still continues to the present day. Okay. So he's a historian. This isn't a Christian apologist. This isn't a guy like trying to defend the resurrection. He's just a historian saying, here's some ways that we can know that a historical event happened. And by the way, the resurrection does live up to all four. That's just a little side note, but that is actually a historical criterion given by a historian. So I would say, listen, if you want to say, oh, it's convoluted, so whatever, I would just say the very fact that it's celebrated at all is a sign that it's historical, because you're not going to get people to celebrate something that didn't happen at all, even in a convoluted sense. Like we're not even in a convoluted sense going to, celebrate the fact that I hit 500 home runs the other day at the Brave Stadium because it didn't happen. Right. I can't even get you to do it in a convoluted sense. It's just not going to happen at all. So that would be my answer to that. The very fact that we celebrate it is evidence of its historicity.
And even I would say, even to add to that, like, even though the differences in celebration or disagreements in how you do that, like a good example of this is how we celebrate Independence Day or July 4th. It's different between communities. Some you have fireworks, sometimes you don't, but we are legitimately celebrating something that happened. It's just there are differences when you go through years of people having different traditions and practices.
Yes, that's a great point. I mean, there's the difference between like the history of ideas and the history of culture That's like a genuine distinction between historians. And so people definitely agree that if you look at history of culture, it's going to be a little bit more convoluted than the history of ideas, because the history of ideas, you've got philosophers like drawing out very clear distinctions and writing it exactly. But with human practice, it's like, with my family, it's just a random little thing. We learned from some friends, like when we make s'mores, a lot of people make them with like Hershey bars. My family, we make them with like all kinds of candy bars, like Twix bars, Reese's, like Baby Ruth, whatever, right? Almond Joy is my favorite.
Yeah.
So it's like, that might be a convoluted way to celebrate Halloween, but a lot of people make s'mores on Halloween, right? And so people have candy, and we're like, we got candy around, let's make s'mores with lots of fun candy bars. Right. And so it's like, that's a convoluted way of celebrating, and it's not like going to be like a philosopher writing some crazy distinction, because people just think of creative ideas and ways to celebrate, and they do it, right? Like even the way it evolved, speaking of Halloween, like the way it evolved over time from being like ways to prank people on a night, and then it became and then some fundraiser happened, I think is the story behind it. Like a fundraiser for charity or something is what made it be about candy and getting candy at doors and stuff. So, it's just weird. History for culture is just, it's a very interesting study, but it's also going to be a little bit muddier and harder to pin down. But because of that, that's why we have to say, like, the mere fact of celebration is evidence of historicity, just because people are going to do things differently.
Right.
And that does backtrack for a second.
Sure.
You said you made s'mores with Almond Joy?
Yes, sir.
I've never seen Seth get off his chair so animated than the Almond Joy.
Dude,
I was not anticipating that at all. I was like, okay, caramel makes sense. I like a little nougat I can see. I'm like,
I will say this: the people that love Almond Joy, they love Almond Joy.
They do love
That's just
Almond Joy.
That is, in fairness, that is my favorite candy bar. So I
love it. There we go.
I love
That'll do it.
The coconut, the almond. It's a great combo, man. I stand that,
I respect it.
All right, let's move on to my third argument. This is the more of Paley, because I guess those last two were Paley's arguments as well. So let's get into more of his arguments, the goat of apologetics. All right. So here are four. So now, I should say those were external arguments. Now we're getting into internal evidences. So now we're going to be looking at things within the Gospels themselves that point to their genuine historicity or reliability overall. So we have four different arguments. Undesigned coincidences, which refers to the authors corroborating details in the other author's stories in undesigned ways. We have artless similarities, which is the characters in the Gospels behave similarly across different contexts, which this argument seeks to show that the people within the stories are real historical people, because if they're in different contexts with different authors behaving the same way, they're going to have, people have idiosyncrasies that and different behaviors that are recognizable, right? And so this argument kind of shows that the people in the Gospels have that. Unexplained allusions. These are allusions to things a specific audience would know about without explanation. So they don't explain it further. They're just like, they allude to something that only a niche group of people would understand, and then they just move on. Fictional authors don't do this. And then unnecessary details. The authors provide details that don't provide anything to the story or the historicity of Jesus. And the reason this argument's important is because people who are lying when they give unnecessary details, they're only doing it to make their story appear more truthful. But you'll see in the Gospels, they're not doing that at all. They're just giving you an unnecessary detail for no reason. So that does not play into the hypothesis that they're making it up. So let's get into two examples of undesigned coincidences. This one is called Why Ask Philip? So in John 6:5, we see Jesus, after raising his eyes and seeing a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that they may eat?" Okay, so a very honest question might come up. Why did he ask Philip? And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Philip doesn't say anything. Not one time do we see Philip have a line. He has no lines. He's the guy he's an extra in the play, right? and then in John, out of nowhere, he's just being asked a question, right? And you can only find the answer if you go to two separate contexts, and that's why this is undesigned. So if you go to Luke chapter 9, we'll see that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida. And Luke just casually drops this, doesn't mention Philip again. Philip does not say anything in Luke's gospel. So we say, okay, and then we go to John chapter 1, completely different chapter. This is when Philip is being introduced, by the way. It says Philip was from Bethsaida. Okay, so now it makes sense. Oh, Jesus asked Philip where they can buy bread because they were in Bethsaida and because he's from there. But you can only answer this question if you go to 3 different contexts, and that's why this is undesigned. Okay, Luke is not trying to fill in something for John, because, by the way, most scholars think that Luke was written before John, so it's like he was like preemptively trying to fill in John. Like, come on, guys. Okay, so, or do we think John was really like trying to just slide this in here in chapter 1? Like, by the way, he's from Bethsaida, and I hope like a really careful reader will pick up later, like when I'm saying, hey, Philip, where do we buy bread, that, hey, go read Luke as well. Like, you'll see, guys, if you're a really careful reader. So anyways, it's just not plausible at all, because also we have to remember that the Bible was not like the Bible. Like it was just a bunch of different documents, right? The New Testament documents are 27 different books. And so are we really going to think John would just know, like, okay, in the future, there's going to be a book called the Bible and they're all going to be able to corroborate one another? Like, you kind of have to keep that in mind too, while you're reading these. All right, now let's go to this one. Jesus
That's a way better explanation than I would have just gave a terrible answer. It would have been like, well, maybe Philip was just overweight and he was singled out like this. This dude knows what bread is.
Why do they got to do my boy like that?
He'll sniff it out.
Hashtag justice for Philip. Like, this guy got owned 2,000 years ago and we're still reading about it.
Jesus says, we know you've been in the market.
Jesus not only gave the best teachings of all time, he gave the greatest burn of all time. It's just forever being here. Awesome. So our second one is going to be where Jesus says, I'm among you as the one who serves. Okay, so I didn't have enough space to put all of the verses here, but you can go check these yourself, skeptics, if you don't believe me. So in Luke 22, basically the disciples are debating, like, which one of us is the greatest? I think I'm the best. You think you're the best, et cetera, et cetera. And Jesus basically corrects them. He's like, guys, the kingdom of heaven is not about that. Okay. The Gentiles have a warped view of who's the greatest. They think it's about who's the king and the ruler and the emperor. And you got to think they're in the Roman Empire. So they're thinking, oh, the emperor and the different guys that are over all the provinces, the procurators, they all think they're the greatest because they have all these servants and all this stuff, right? But Jesus says, not so. I'm among you as the one who serves. Now, in Luke's gospel, that statement kind of seems out of place. You don't know why he would say that. You maybe could pull it from other contexts, but it kind of seems like Jesus has been the leader the whole time in the Gospel of Luke. He's the one teaching. He's the one healing people. And so you might think he kind of looks like one of the Gentiles almost. He's definitely the greatest among these guys. What does he, or what right does he have to say he's among them as the one who serves? It's only until we go to the Gospel of John. And again, this is at the Lord's Supper. So this is the context of Luke 22. When we go to John at the Last Supper, we see the story of the washing of the feet, where Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Now it makes sense. He just washed their feet, and that was a servant's job. That was a slave's job, right? And so, and again, John is not adding this to like fill in for Luke. He's not like, oh, Luke said that Jesus served. Let me like make up this story to fill in for. It's undesigned. There's nothing in John that would make you think he's trying to fill in for Luke. And again, Luke was written before John. So this line was in there from the beginning. And so again, we have these undesigned ways that they're corroborating one another's testimony. So this tells us a couple things. Number one, Jesus probably did wash their feet. This is probably a historical thing. And number two, that Jesus probably really did say this, and that this debate really did happen. And so if a lot of people want to say, oh, the dialogue and the Gospels are made up, well, this is ways that you can see, like, no, they actually have historical plausibility because they're corroborated in other areas. So, and there are, by the way, dozens of undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, like literally dozens. Like I could give a ton of other examples, but we're going to move on. Okay, artless similarity. So again, just a refresher, this is to try to show that different characters show the same characteristics throughout different stories. So we're going to read about Mary and Martha in the Gospel of John. We all know this story. This is when Lazarus is being raised from the dead. If you're a Christian, you grew up in church, you've heard the story 1,000 times. Lazarus, come out, that whole thing, right? And so when Martha, when she hears Jesus is coming to her house, she runs out to meet him, okay? But Mary, she stayed in the house. She's sitting, she's chilling. But when Mary did come out, when we skip forward like 10 verses, Mary comes to the place where Jesus was, and she falls at his feet, okay? And she says to him, like, hey, if only you'd been here, my brother would have lived, or whatever. And then a little bit later, if we jump forward another 7 verses, Jesus says, all right, move the stone. I'm about to raise Lazarus from the dead. Martha says, Lord, there's going to be a stench. He's been dead for 4 days, right? So let's kind of analyze the 2 characters we have here. We have Martha, who, when Jesus shows up, she's running out to meet him. She's the house. She takes care of the house. She's the one trying to host a guest. She's trying to be a good host. Like, oh, Jesus is coming. Let me go out and meet him. And she's the one worried about the prudential stuff. Like, oh, it's going to smell. Like, let's not do this, God, you know? But Mary, she's just chilling. And then she runs and falls at his feet when he's there. Now let's read Luke 10, keeping these personalities in mind. Now, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him at the home. Oh, we have Martha again, the one welcoming him. All right. But then she had a sister, Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet. Oh, what do we have again? Mary is sitting at her feet, listening to the word. And then Mary goes on to be distracted by the household chores and duties. And she's like, God, like, aren't you going to tell her to get up and serve? And he says, actually, she's the one that has the right thing. You know, I'm not going to be here forever, right? We've all heard the story. But again, we have Mary. She's more contemplative. She's sitting at his feet. She's more worshipful. And then we have Martha, who's going out, and she's the host, and she's worried about the prudential stuff. And again, this is best explained by the hypothesis that they're referring to real women named Mary and Martha, right? That have these real personalities, okay? And there are other examples like Jesus. My favorite one about Jesus is he's challenged about healing on the Sabbath a couple of times. So one time in Matthew, they're like, you can't heal on the Sabbath. Like, how dare you do this? And how does Jesus respond? He says, how many of you have a sheep who falls in a hole on a Sabbath who won't get it out? How much more valuable is this person than that sheep? So the logic of the teaching is, you have animals. You would help them on the Sabbath if they were in trouble. Humans are more valuable than they are. We go to Luke, totally different context. There's a woman. She's been bent over double, it says, for like multiple years. I think like 12 years or something. And again, he heals her. And the scribes, again, they're getting upset. How dare you do this? And what does he say? How many of you have a donkey who on the Sabbath would not untie him and bring him to water if he was thirsty? How much more valuable is she than this donkey? It's the exact same answer. And so do we think Matthew and Luke are just making this up? Or do we think that this is how Jesus actually responded to being challenged about healing on the Sabbath? Right? And we could go into Peter and how impulsive he is. Like there's multiple examples of this. So this is a characteristic across multiple characters, not just Mary and Martha. Let's go to the next one. Unexplained delusions. All right. So again, this is going to be allusions to things that only certain people would understand, and they're unexplained. Like we get no further detail. So in Luke 13, just to summarize this, he's basically dealing with scribes, and they're asking him questions. And basically they're saying like, this person was punished. Is it because they're a sinner? And he goes, no, that's not how this works, guys. If you don't repent, you're going to likewise perish. Or those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them. Do you think they were worse offenders? Who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, unless you repent, you likewise will perish. So we get some allusion to this tower that fell in Siloam and people perished and they died. There was 18 people that died. No explanation. Now think about if this was a fiction story. Think about how fiction authors write when things like this happen. They would go into a diatribe about, a year ago, this tower fell and this happened. And then they'd get back into the story. But that's not what happens here. Luke's just telling you what Jesus said. No explanation. Just going to keep going. In John 1, we see another one. Philip found Nathanael and said, we have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and the prophets, also about Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Come and see. No explanation. And actually, funnily enough, a lot of people thought Nazareth was made up for a long time. Scholars, again, treating the Bible guilty until proven innocent. because we didn't have anything about Nazareth until recently. It's been overturned, but people in that time would have realized, oh yeah, Nazareth is like some tiny little village. Like, who cares about that place? Can anything good come out of there? So these are illusions that a fiction writer would not say. Like, if a fiction writer was writing this, they would have explained, like, Nazareth was a small village, and like they explain every little detail. Historical teachings don't do this. All right, unnecessary details. Again, this is important because when liars put unnecessary details into their stories, they do it to make it appear honest. Okay, so let's look at this. John chapter 3. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples, and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, Jesus is over there baptizing people, basically, to summarize what he said. Why did they bring this up? I think about it. There's a debate between some Jews and John's disciples. All right, over there, Jesus is baptizing people. It's just so random.
Right.
It's not necessary. Fiction writers don't write like this. Mark 3:17, James the son of Zebedee and John the brother, they were given the names the sons of thunder in parentheses, right? Again, we saw this in Justin Martyr. That's the memoirs of Peter, right? And Mark. So again, why say this? He doesn't explain it. And in fact, an undesigned coincidence with this right here is that in Luke's gospel, we actually hear a story about how James and John were like, let's call down thunder on these guys there, fire from heaven on these people that, so that's a random undesigned coincidence for you on that. Like, because in Mark's gospel, you wouldn't know, like, why were they called that? Like, he doesn't say. And then we see in Luke that they actually call that down. So now that actually makes sense. So tell me, what about these details make you believe the testimony of Mark or John about the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus more? The casualness of these unnecessary details is what makes them have evidential weight in the cumulative case. The casualness is really important. It's like how they just say something and then move on. Fiction writers, again, they don't write this way. So you take all those four Paleyan arguments together, and it's like you've got some good stuff here. We're coming up on the end. Some final internal markers of reliability. I have 3 right here. So number 1, we have a formal controlled tradition. So I need to break this down. This is scholarly terms again. So all formal means is that you are not allowed to add to what is in the Gospels. Like, basically there are people on top of the tradition, like the apostles themselves, who are making sure that things aren't being added and subtracted to it. And I'm going to explain how we know that over here in a second. And controlled just goes again, there are people that are authoritative that are not letting it change. So that's all this means. So there are informal controlled traditions. There are informal uncontrolled traditions. You get the idea. The Gospels are the most controlled kind of tradition there is. Formal, controlled. There are people at the top, and they're not letting things be added to it. Okay. We learned this from Papias' writings. Papias is writing again towards the end of the 1st century, or the very beginning of the 2nd century. And he says that basically he is getting all his information from those who were apostles or those who knew the apostles directly. And so this tells us very importantly that people weren't just asking random guys. Again, this goes against the idea that the Gospels are anonymous, random Greek-speaking guys that were far away. This goes completely against that idea. This is our earliest writings. We have the preservation of the sayings of Jesus. They're very consistent across Gospels. And finally, if you're familiar with this concept called Markan priority in the Gospels, the idea is that Mark was written first based on Peter's testimony. And then Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. And if you look at the places where Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, they are very conservative with the content. They do not change it. A lot of times they're quoting him word for word. So that tells us that these guys are really trying to preserve the content. And that gives us markers of reliability. These guys are not feeling free to make things up. They're not having the liberty to just be like, oh, well, whatever. If Jesus said this or that, who cares? No, they're trying very hard to keep the content the same. And that's the importance of this marker of reliability. Protective anonymity. This one, again, is fun. So the Gospels protect the identity of those who would be in danger before their deaths. And you need to think about this. Why would they be in danger unless what they're telling is true? I ask my skeptic friends, why am I protecting people if they're not telling the truth? Okay. So here is an example of this. So in Mark's gospel, we see that at Jesus' trial, one of the disciples cuts off the ear of the soldier. And if you don't know, Peter was killed in about 62 AD. Okay. And John's gospel was written in the 90s. Okay. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we just see a disciple cut off the soldier's ear. And John, he's like, yeah, that was Peter. And Peter's dead at this point. So he doesn't need to protect Peter's identity anymore, right? So they're protecting people's identity. Like when Matthew and Luke is written, because I think they were written in like the 50s, 60s area, Peter's still alive. So we're still protecting him. Okay. And then we see in John, oh yeah, that was Peter. And then there are other examples, like in Mark, we see the location of the Lord's Supper is kept on the down low in Mark. Okay. And it's not until later that we find out where it is and stuff like that. So we see patterns in the Gospels where it's like in the earlier ones, like Mark and Matthew and Luke, there are some things that are like kept on the DL. And then by the time you get to John, it's kind of more free because he's like the last one alive. So very cool stuff. This, again, shows that they're telling the truth because it's like they're trying to protect Peter's identity, right? Because he would have been in danger because that really was something that happened. Okay. Now, finally, and this is probably the most fun one, this is the idiosyncrasies of the authors. So I have a little document over here. It won't be on the screen, but I'll just give you some examples of what I mean by this. Because again, if we remember, Matthew, what do we know about Matthew? He's a tax collector, right? Mm-hmm. So we'd expect him to know quite a bit about money. So in Matthew 17, Peter is asked about paying the temple tax. He asks Jesus, and Jesus says, all right, we don't really have to pay the temple tax, but I want you to go catch a fish, and in the fish's mouth, you're going to find a stater. Now, this is interesting because a stater is the exact amount, that coin is the exact amount that would pay for two people's taxes, Peter and Jesus's. Okay. Mm. So this is a very specific coin that is exactly what is needed to pay for both Peter and Jesus's taxes. So this author of, again, the author of Matthew, is he a random Greek-speaking author that's unfamiliar with temple tax? Or is he a Jew that knew what the temple tax was and was familiar with coins? That sounds like Matthew to me. In Matthew 20, Jesus tells a parable about workers, and they get paid a denarius a day, right? A lot of translations today say like a penny a day or whatever because it's modern coins. But in the Greek, it's a denarius a day. And this is actually similar to what a worker could negotiate for a day's wage in that time. Here's another interesting fact. Money is mentioned 31 times in Matthew, 14 times in Luke, and only 6 times in Mark. Well, this is just little things that corroborate, once again, the outside sources that tell us Matthew wrote this. Let's go to Mark. Mark calls Capernaum home when speaking about Jesus. Jesus isn't from Capernaum. He's from Nazareth. But guess what? Peter lived in Capernaum. So, again, Peter. Mark protects Peter's identity in those areas I told you about, and he also protects his dignity. There's one instance in Mark's gospel where Jesus is teaching something, and it goes, a disciple asked a question, and Jesus looked to them and said, "Are you so dull? Like, are you stupid?" Like, and then like basically explains it. And then in one of the later gospels, I think it's Luke, he tells us that was Peter. and so again, Mark is protecting Peter from being called stupid. So not only does he protect him from the soldier's instance, but he also protects him from when he says stupid things and Jesus calls him out for it. And there's also a literary device. This is a little technical. It's from Richard Bauckham. It's called the Inclusio of Eyewitness Testimony. And all that means, it's just a fancy way of saying that Mark is the first person mentioned, or Peter is the first person mentioned in Mark, and he's the last person mentioned in Mark. And the way that biographers would tell you who their main source of information was is they would do that right there. They would make it the first and last person that is mentioned in a particular section. And so that was Mark's way of saying, hey, by the way, Peter's my main guy. By the way, John does that too for the beloved disciple. Random fact for you. So now let's go to Luke. So what do we know about Luke? Remember, we learned in the Meritorian fragment, he's a physician. He's a doctor. Okay, so if we're going to see, like in the Gospel of Luke, if it's written by a doctor, we're going to expect to see some medical stuff, right? And that's exactly what we find. He shows he has the most medical knowledge of all the gospel authors. He uses Greek words that are only used in medical books. So there are some terms in Luke's gospel that we have literally no other documentation of except in medical books in the ancient world. So it's like,
Wow.
He's familiar with books that only doctors would be familiar with. His preface of his gospel also aligns almost word for word with what Hippocrates wrote, which is the guy we mentioned in Augustine's quote at the beginning. He was a physician, okay? And Hippocrates wrote a medical treatise, and Luke's preface to his gospel quotes it almost word for word. He just changes a couple things around to fit what he's trying to say. So again, if Luke's a physician, then this is the kind of thing we would expect. But if it's just a random anonymous guy that was writing that didn't know Palestine, again, it's just not. I hope by this point in the presentation you see that this idea that scholars think that the Gospels are anonymous, random, it's ridiculous. Finally, we have John. So John, tradition tells us he is a fisherman, right? And in John 6 and in John 21, John refers to the Sea of Galilee. But what a lot of people don't know is that sea actually had two different names. It was actually attributed to Tiberius. And so in John's gospel, he calls it the Sea of Galilee and the Sea of Tiberius. He's a fisherman. He would know this kind of thing. And in John 6, they go out to the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And John tells us the exact distance they travel, 25 to 30 stadia, which is about 3 or 4 miles. And guess what? That's the middle of the Sea of Galilee. He's a fisherman.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of thing a fisherman would know. Okay. And there's lots of details in John's gospel that shows that he's familiar with the geography of Jesus's ministry. He gives a lot of details like that. So again, is this anonymous? It seems just blatantly not the case. All right, let's go to finally the end of the presentation, objections. So the first one is one I've been talking about this whole time. The gospel is written by anonymous Greek-speaking men who were not eyewitnesses to the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I hope we can see by now that that's insane. Number 2, the gospels contain contradictions. Okay, this is a very important one. So I need to say that the gospels nowhere have a logical contradiction. So what I mean by this is, in John's gospel, at the appearance at the tomb, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. At nowhere in any other gospel does it say Jesus did not appear to Mary Magdalene. Okay, that's a contradiction. That does not exist in the gospels. Okay, there is no instance of that. However, there are some discrepancies in peripheral details. However, I really, really recommend, I cannot recommend this book enough. Mike Lacona just came out with a book called Jesus Contradicted. It is all about this. If you are, looking at the discrepancies and you're wondering how to deal with these, the Gospels are within a genre called ancient biography. And within ancient biography, there are compositional devices. And so, and this is going to sound to skeptics like crazy, but I promise you, this is all database. This is not ad hoc. This is just, if you study this, the documents themselves, this is what we see within them. So basically what Mike Lacona did is he went into Plutarch's biographies, which is the same genre as the Gospels. And he looked at areas where they told the same story multiple times. Okay. And he saw that there were these compositional devices that Plutarch would use. So here's some examples. Like you would have an event that happened at one point, and then in another biography, it happened 7 years later. Okay, like he moved an event 7 years. And this can be seen. A lot of people have a problem with Jesus's cleansing of the temple, because in John's gospel, it happens at the beginning of his ministry. At the other three, it happens at the end. This is a literary device. In John or in Mark, it was moved. And this is just literally what biographers would do. This isn't a contradiction. And we see this, Mike Licona goes through these rhetoric books called the Prosmenigata, I think is what they're called. It's a big Greek word. And essentially, they were rhetoric textbooks that would teach people how to write. And you were expected to use these devices. Everyone was. So it is the expectations of the time to use these compositional devices in order to make it almost like an art form. So picture someone's painting a picture of someone. They're making a portrait of someone. You kind of give the character some personality by like the expression on their face, what they're holding in their hand, the setting that they're in, the background. Like you make it like a picture. And what Plutarch explains in his biographies is that's what he's doing. He's painting a literary portrait of the character in writing form. Okay. And so what he said was, I'm going to leave it to the historians to just give you the facts of their conquests and all that stuff. I'm writing lives. I'm writing biographies. I'm not writing a history book for you. Okay. And so he took upon himself liberties with details using these compositional devices in order to spice up his characters and make it so you could know who the character was. And in the same way, the gospel authors who are writing biographies are using these compositional devices as well in order to tell you who Jesus is. And Mike Licona does an amazing job of showing how this can actually tell you who Jesus is, because what biographers would do is they would try to tell you who the person in the gospel is based on their words and deeds. Okay. So if you look in the Gospel of Mark, he, at one point it says that he forgave sins, right? And then the Pharisees immediately recognize, who can forgive sins but God alone? And then Jesus forgives sins on his own authority, right? He says, so you know that I have authority to forgive sins? Just get up and walk. Okay. We see in the next chapter, he's walking on water. In Job, it says that God treads on water. God alone does that. Okay. And in the same story, and in a different story, he calms the winds and the waves. He says, peace, be still. In the Old Testament, we see that God controls the weather. Okay. So Mark is telling you who Jesus is by his words and deeds. That's what biographers were doing. Okay. And so this is the primary way we should deal with quote unquote contradictions. It's that the gospel authors are biographers. They're writing biographies. They're trying to tell you who Jesus is. This doesn't mean they're not telling you the truth. This is literally just how biographies were written back then. And they were telling you historical events too. It's not like they were making it up. A lot of people would say that, oh, they're just making these things up. No, Jesus was doing these things so that you could know who he was. And then the biographers wrote it this way. Okay. And so, and also, by the way, eyewitness testimony, it's like basically guaranteed you're going to have discrepancies in details because they have different focuses. They have different emphases. They have different goals. As we saw, Matthew's trying to write to the Jews. Luke is trying to write to Theophilus so he can have like a knowledge of who Jesus is. John explicitly tells you in chapter 21, I'm writing to you so you can know Jesus is the Son of God. Like they all have different reasons. And in fact, if they all agreed on every single detail, what they would say is, oh, well, they were colluding. They were trying to make all their details perfect. And so the fact that there are discrepancies actually builds reliability. It doesn't take it away. And finally, the Gospels contain miracles. So a lot of times people reject the Gospels just because there are miracles in it. And I think this is just question begging personally, because they're basically saying like, oh, well, these miracles didn't happen because miracles don't happen. And it's like, all right, nice circle you got there. So if someone isn't going to just presume and assume that miracles are impossible, so if you're not just going to beg the question for naturalism, then you're going to have to deal with all the evidence that I presented tonight to avoid the unwanted conclusion that miracles actually can happen, because any non-zero probability can be overcome in light of new evidence. And what I mean by this is, if miracles are not impossible, meaning they have higher than zero probability, the more evidence that's provided for it, the more likely it becomes. You can't just ask, how likely are miracles without any evidence? You now have to ask, how likely is a miracle given the evidence that you've seen? I believe all the evidence I've presented tonight in favor of the testimony of the life, ministry, and death and resurrection of Jesus shows that we have eyewitness accounts, shows that they're reliable in what they provide, shows that there are no contradictions in them, and therefore we should trust them. And so if you're just going to say, oh, well, there's miracles, I can't doubt it. Well, again, unless you're just going to beg the question, which is circular reasoning, and okay, I'm just going to reject it on that basis. If you're actually going to say, okay, miracles aren't impossible, well, then now you have to deal with the evidence. And my hypothesis is that you won't be able to. So there's my presentation. That's why I trust the Gospels.
Well done.
Round of applause. Well done. We have many questions, I'm sure.
Yes.
Seth, you have many questions, Seth. I know you do.
I do. I wrote out a couple on my phone, so I just got my phone propped up. So my first one right away was. Hold up, how do we do?
I'm just going to bring us all up onto the stage, so you let me know, Nathan, if you want your presentation back up.
Okay.
When you brought up the original point on.
Wrong. There.
Gosh, what are you doing? Okay.
I'm messing with it. All right, it's good.
You got it? Are you good?
Sorry. I'm producer and co-host, so.
Okay. When you brought up how we don't know authors' names due to their writings, like Aristotle and Plato, what would you do to somebody who would just bite the bullet and say, well, yeah, we don't know, and it's impossible to know? Just the ultimate skeptic of saying we cannot know any author of any old document.
Okay, well, that's a great question, because I know some people are starting to do that because it's like the evidence is so strong for the Gospels. Yeah. So what you would want to point them to, I guess you could say, is that the attestation to the Gospel authorship is so close that it's actually not reasonable to question it. So like for someone like Plato, you could say, okay, I see why you'd question it. It's like our first manuscript of his writings is hundreds of years later, right? Mm-hmm. We don't know if that's actually word for word what he wrote. We don't know if like it was changed over time. We don't know how reliable this is. But with the Gospels, not so. We have attestation from the 1st century, from the 2nd century, from the 3rd century. We have manuscripts. We have thousands of manuscripts. And they all have titles on them except for one. Like I said, there's only one that doesn't have a title on it. And what I mean by title is they'll say like the Gospel according to Matthew or the Gospel according to Luke or something like this. So the evidence is so universal and close to the time in question. That's actually not a reasonable position. And if they wanted to question that, they're basically saying you can't know a historical fact at all. Mm-hmm. And at that point, they're being too hyper skeptical, and that's just absurd. I would say that they need to study epistemology, the theory of knowledge, because we actually can know things, and there are ways to come to knowledge. And in fact, one of the 4 main pathways to knowledge is human testimony. A lot of people don't know that. There are 4 main, avenues to knowledge, and they are memory, perception, reason, and human testimony. And in fact, human testimony is one of the major ways that we come to knowledge of most things that we know. So for example, we're all speaking English right now. You learned English based on human testimony, because when your parents were saying words, you trusted that they were using correct ones. And when they made noises with their mouth, because when you're a baby, you just hear a bunch of gibberish, right? But you eventually learned and you trusted like, oh, when they're making sounds, those sounds correspond to something that's real. And you eventually learned the language based on testimony. And so we could never even become the kinds of people that can have conversations without testimony. And so I think another thing you could say is like, if people are going to be so skeptical of testimony, what you should do is make them aware of how important testimony is to our overall knowledge, period. And I think showing them that, like, hey, we're having a conversation right now, that's evidence that testimony teaches you stuff. And so, like, you shouldn't be this skeptical of it, because it actually is a really useful tool to help you know things.
Got it.
Bouncing off of this line, I'm wondering if, because I'm thinking of skeptics and this line of well, the first Gospels weren't written until some odd time after the workings of Jesus, 50 or 60 years or whatever you were saying, Nathan. I think along the earliest Gospel is tracked to around that far. I wonder if some of that stems from we're a little bit victims of our current time, where information is like so immediate, like the breaking news cycle is so it's everywhere. You go on Twitter and there's a new breaking news thing, and people have their phones, so they report on it immediately. And so maybe you can speak to this, like if someone was skeptical and they said, well, why didn't the disciples write this down immediately as it was happening? Why did it take them 30, 40, 50 years to write down this event and speak to the modern audience who is so used to immediate information when it happens?
That's a really, really good question. So there's a few things to say to this. Number one, I would say that when it comes to the ancient world, they were much, much more reliant upon oral traditions. Like, they would say things. And if you look at Jesus's teachings, they're actually something called kriya. That's the Greek word for it. And basically what that means is they're in poetic form. There's a lot of alliteration and rhyming that goes on and plays on words. Remember in the presentation, I said that, Jesus, he said, like, you guys tithe, dill, and mint, and cumin, but you're neglecting the weightier things of the law. Like, he's using a pun so that what he's saying is more memorable, right? Or if you look in Matthew 16, when he says, your name is Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. The word Peter means pebble. So again, it's a play on words. You are a pebble, and on this rock I'll build my church. So it's a memorable statement. And also, it's important to know that early church fathers say that Peter taught in kriya as well. So what Peter was doing was he was taking Jesus's teachings that he had memorized word for word, because you have to remember, Jesus is an itinerant speaker. I actually love J. Warner Wallace and some of these other apologists. They talk about this, how they give speeches at college campuses, and they go around and they travel around and they give the same talks over and over and over again. And this is basically what Jesus did. You can tell by his teachings that these are things that he rehearsed. He did not just come up with these things on the fly. And I know a lot of people want to say, oh no, he was God, he came up with all this stuff on the fly. That I know he's God, but you have to understand, he's speaking to human beings and he accommodated for them. And so he came up with poems and plays on words and puns and different ways of communicating that would make it so humans could remember what he would say. And so you got to think, being his disciple, following him around for 3 years, hearing the same poems over and over and over again, hearing the same plays on words, hearing the same teachings over and over and over again. It becomes to a point where I heard J. Warner Wallace, he was talking to, I want to say it was Frank Turek, and he said, like, I could give your talk. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I've heard it 50 times. Like, I could do it right now, and so basically you have to imagine if Peter and Matthew and Luke and all these guys, well, Luke wasn't a disciple, but you know what I mean? Like, the disciples, they hear this 1,000 times. They probably got to a point where they could be like, I could do the Sermon on the Mount right now, Yeah. And so when Jesus died, that's what they did. They went around and they preached his kriya, his teachings, his sayings, and they said it over and over and over and over again, to the point where it's like, it's absurd to think that they didn't have it completely memorized, because their memory was so much better than ours. So, for example, back then, the Pharisees had the entire Old Testament memorized.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy.
The entire dude, what?
Bro, that's kind of insane.
The Old Testament is huge, dude. And it's like, and I also love, by the way, this is another little nugget, the way that Jesus would rebuke the Pharisees. He would use phrases that are like specifically in the Old Testament to like bring a story to their memory, so that he would condemn them in a very cool way. Like, he would basically be like, he would be condemning them with using one word. And this shows that Jesus was a genius, by the way. So like you hear the words, and to a normal person that doesn't have the Torah memorized, you would just be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But to the Pharisees, they would be like, oh, you just said I'm a Goliath, like screw you, like how dare you, you know, like like you just compared me to the Pharaoh, how dare you, like, and that's why they were always so mad at him, because he was like bringing up like stories from the Old Testament.
He would always set up his he would always set up his dunks too with saying like, have you not read, and he would always set it up like that.
Yeah, so like he was like such a gangster, by the way, and like it was just crazy. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say. Like memory back then was so much better than ours today. Like our memory is horrible because we don't need it. Like, you know, we have these things, right? We have phones. Like I can look up anything I want all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't need to memorize anything. I remember when I was a kid, even I had a bunch of people's phone numbers memorized because cell phones didn't exist. I don't need to do that anymore. I don't know anyone's phone number except like maybe my mom's or something, like, but that's because she's had the same phone number since I was a kid and I memorized it when I was a kid. And so it's like, I don't know anyone's phone number that's given me their phone number recently, you know? Like I was recently in like a 4-year relationship and I don't know her number off the top of my head. I'd have to go look it up. It's just like, okay, you know, so all that to say, like memory back then was so different. And if people today, like J. Warner Wallace, could memorize Frank Turek's speeches basically to the point where he could give it, how much more could someone in the ancient world who's hearing a poem that's specifically designed to be memorized over and over and over and over again, how much more would he remember it like 30 years later? Especially when he's preaching it the whole time, right? Peter was killed in 62 AD. So he preached it for like 30 years. So it's like, why would they think it wasn't memorized? Like, I just don't understand their objection makes no sense. Like they just, I think they're honestly, and I don't use this word ignorant in a mean way. I just think they're ignorant of the time period. And if they were just educated about the kind of things that the apostles were doing, like they act like they just saw the resurrection and then sat on their hands for 30 years and then wrote the Gospels. That's just not what happened. And so if you think about the fact that they were preachers who were going around preaching the gospel over and over and over again, and then they wrote it down, it's really not that plausible to think that they would. And also, I would never forget if I saw Jesus feed thousands of people with a couple pieces of bread and a couple pieces of fish. Like, who's forgetting that, by the way?
Yeah.
Not me.
Yeah.
If you forget that, like, I don't even know, like, what's your life like? It must be sick. I mean, like, you know, right? Like Elon Musk might forget that, but the rest of us are not going to forget that, right? So, so it's just, anyways, these are the kinds of things that wouldn't be forgotten. And when we come up to the idea that they repeated it so many times, it's like, it's not even reasonable to think that they would not remember it in 30 years.
Well, I guess possibly to switch topic a little bit, this isn't directly on that, but when it comes to the Gnostic Gospels, it seems as though a lot of skeptics are starting to try to bring that back to the mainstream. Like, I think Alex O'Connor, as much as I like him as like a pretty balanced atheist, I think that he's probably one of the worst with this because he acts as if it's never been answered. And he continues to bring it up in almost every single objection towards like
what about the Gnostic Gospels?
Exactly. He always questions it like, oh, they were just thrown out because of a random court decided it. It's like that we know that that's not historically true. So I guess why do you think, well, number one, what actually happened? And then number two, why do you think that skeptics continue to try to redo history and rewrite it in a way to bring it back to mainstream?
Oh man, a lot to go into there. There's actually a book. It's right here. This is called The Gospel and the Gospels by Simon Gathercole. Highly recommend it. So this book, it's basically, and I will do videos on this in the future. So if people just go to my channel, maybe if you're watching this in like 5 years for some reason, I'll have lots of videos on this book. So, but basically the premise behind this idea is he's saying that the Gospels are qualitatively different than the Gnostic Gospels. And there are a few distinctive things that he points out that are in the Gospels that are not in the Gnostic Gospels. So number one, and I think the most important one, the canonical Gospels view Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Okay. So, excuse me. So the word Christ. So fun fact for anyone listening, Christ is not Jesus's last name. Last names did not exist back then. Okay. This is actually a trick question you can ask people. What was Jesus' last name? They're probably going to say Christ. And that's not actually true. The word Christ is a transliteration of the word for Messiah in the Old Testament. Okay. So basically, when they're calling him Jesus Christ, and when we call him Jesus Christ, we're saying Jesus Messiah. Okay. We're recognizing him as the Messiah. And in the Gnostic Gospels, they don't call him the Christ, the Messiah. They have no concept of the idea that he is fulfilling something, right? And you see this all in the Gospels. Matthew is like almost annoying about it. He's like, this prophecy was fulfilled. This prophecy was fulfilled. Like he's like hammering it home. This guy's the Messiah, right? And in John, Jesus says a couple times to the Pharisees, like, you look in the scriptures and you think you have life in them, but I'm standing right here in front of you. And those scriptures are testifying about me. Okay. Like there's this consistent concept that Jesus is here for a purpose. He's fulfilling something. In the Gospels, this is not the case, or in the Gnostic Gospels, rather, like in the Gospel of Thomas, he basically is just like, he's there and he's like, hey, Thomas, come over here. I've got some secret knowledge to tell you. And this secret knowledge will bring you salvation. And this is how the Gnostic Gospels are. They're all about this secret knowledge. And they're basically like, again, there's no concept of the Old Testament. There's no idea of fulfillment. There's no idea of like, he's here to crush the head of the serpent, as Genesis 3 talks about with the fall. You know, like we have this theme in at the fall of Adam and Eve where God says to the serpent, he says, I'm going to put enmity between your seed and her seed, and her seed is going to crush your head, and you will bruise his heel. Mm-hmm. And then throughout the Old Testament, we see this theme of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Okay. And so we see that basically the enemies of God are the seed of the serpent, and the children of God are the seed of the woman. This is why, by the way, in the story of David and Goliath, he says, I'm going to take off your head. And that's why he hits him in the head. And that's also why when they describe his armor, the armor is said to have scales on it. Okay. He's a seed of the serpent, and the children of God are the seed of the woman. Okay. And that's why when Paul in the New Testament is converted, you'll see it says he had scales fall off of his eyes. What they're saying is he was going from a seed of the serpent to a seed of the woman. Okay. And that's why if you look in 1 John, John also says, if you practice sin, you are a seed of the devil. Your father is the devil. That's what he's talking about. You are one of his seed from Genesis 3. Okay. So again, there's this theme going throughout the Bible that there are the enemies of God and there are the friends of God. And then you look at the Gnostic Gospels and it's just like, come get this secret knowledge, bro, like, and it'll save you. And it's just like completely detached from the Old Testament. And I think that's Simon Gathercole's main point, is that the Gnostic Gospels are completely removed from Jewish context. They have no Jewish flavor to them. They don't view Jesus as the Messiah, as like the fulfillment of the Old Testament. They're all about secret knowledge. They have Greek philosophy in them. They also, some of them explicitly say like God was of the Old Testament is evil, like, and so it's like very Marcion almost, like you have to escape this physical world because it's evil. So it's just like when you look at the Gospels that are in the Bible, that's just not what they are, right? And also, if you look at all of our testimony as well, like again, I would point you to all the quotes I showed at the beginning of the PowerPoint. Notice how the Gospel of Thomas is not there. The Gospel of Philip's not there. Gospel of Mary. These documents were never accepted by any Christian ever, right? And if you even look at the manuscript evidence, the Gospels, there are thousands of manuscripts of them. We have like, I think 2 manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas. We have 1 copy of the Gospel of Philip. It's like no one even preserved these. because they were never seen as authoritative. So to answer your question about why Alex O'Connor and these atheists like try to bring them in, to be honest with you, I don't have an answer other than they'll do anything to reject Orthodox Christianity. Like I want to be charitable to Alex because I do agree with you. I think he's a pretty level-headed atheist, but if I'm honest, I really don't see another good reason. Like I just, it's like anything to reject orthodoxy. And because the evidence for the Gnostic Gospels is so scanty, it's like absurd to even try to bring it in. So I can't even give you a good answer for why they tried to do it other than to just say they don't want to accept orthodoxy. And you can see it by the way they talk too. They're like, they'll say, oh, well, the church fathers were fighting for orthodoxy. Like they'll throw like little statements in there like that. And what they're doing is they're trying to say like Irenaeus and Tertullian, like what they're doing is they're just trying to keep all the other types of Christianity out. And these guys were just a persecuted group of Christians. And there were lots of different kinds of Christians in the early centuries. And then Catholicism won. Like that's their narrative. Like, oh, there were lots of different kinds of Christians. And then Catholicism won, and that's the narrative, right? And that's just a false historical narrative. There's no evidence of it because Roman Catholicism, and this is going to get my Catholics mad, but that's not the way the early church functioned. Okay, the idea of like Roman primacy didn't really come around until Constantine, right? When the Roman Empire made Christianity the state religion. Before that, it was kind of like Irenaeus says that you should follow Rome because Peter and Paul started it. But the reason he said that is because he wanted you to keep apostolic doctrine. And then you see other people before 325. So anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that's just not how the early church functioned. It wasn't like, Irenaeus is like, you're not Catholic, get out of here. Like, that's just not the way they spoke. So all that to say, I think their narrative is false. The evidence for it is not there. Anything to reject Christianity.
This is more of a broad zooming out question, but why, as a Christian, should I care about the reliability of the Gospels? Like, give me why do I need to know this level of detail? Why should I study this type of apologetic? When I like the Bible, I go to church, I pray to God, and I have godly experiences. Why do I need to know this verifiable detail about when this was written in and this type of linguistic argument type of thing? I kind of give for the maybe the Christian that's a little bit more apathetic towards these type of arguments. What would be the sell?
Well, if they're still watching at this point, welcome to caring about this stuff because we're an hour and a half in. So, no, I think only the people that care are going to watch this far. But I will say that there's two things I want to say. Number one, I do not believe every Christian is called to study this to the depth that I have. So I want to be clear. I don't think that you guys are like failing as Christians if you haven't studied this to the depth that I have. This is just something I really am passionate about. I really feel called to. And I think that people are studying all kinds of great stuff. Like I have a buddy, the guy that commented earlier, Curious Christianity, that debated Kent Hovind last night. Yeah. He really studies Genesis, and he's like really in the weeds on Genesis chapter 3, for example. He does great work in that area. I have other friends who study like and go just argue against atheism. So I think all that to say, like, you can kind of get spread out and find something that you're passionate about within Christianity. However, I will say this. The Bible commands us to be able to give a reason for our belief. 1 Peter 3:15. It says, always be prepared to give an answer or a reason for the hope that's within you. And people always forget the end of the verse, but it says, but always do so with gentleness and respect. Okay, so don't forget that part. Do it kindly. Do it gently. Don't be rude. I see a lot of people that get into apologetics. They're very argumentative. They're very rude about it. They're very triumphalistic and arrogant. Do not be that way. Be level-headed. Have the fruit of the Spirit. But this is a biblical command to be able to defend our faith. And so I will say, if you can't defend your faith at all, that is a that's not good. I would say that we're commanded in Scripture, so you should at least be able to defend it a little bit. Now, again, I don't think you need to know everything I know about the Gospels. I don't think you need to get into the weeds on everything. But if you can't even answer the question, like, why are you not Muslim? Like, why are you Christian and not Muslim? Or like, why aren't you a Jehovah's Witness? Or like, why are you a Christian? If you can't give a good answer to that question, then you should do some studying until you can give a good answer to those questions. And so, and to give some practical advice, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul puts our entire faith on the resurrection. He says, if Christ is not risen from the dead, our faith is worthless and we're still in our sins. And so go to the resurrection, study the resurrection. There's another book right here. I'm just going to keep recommending books.
That's good.
Knocking over them. Okay. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Wow, my lights are making that hard to see. Okay. Gary Habermas, Mike Licona. Right there. This is a popular level book that defends the resurrection. This is one I recommend to people if you don't know much about it. Just understand why we believe the resurrection happened, because if the resurrection didn't happen, our faith's in vain. If you think the resurrection didn't happen, then okay, Christianity's false. But I think based on the arguments I gave tonight and the arguments in this book and others, we have really good reason to believe the resurrection of Jesus happened, and therefore you should be a Christian. There are some bigger books like that one right there, The Resurrection of Jesus by Mike Licona. Right there, The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. I have The Beholder, Jesus is God. I've got a bunch of them right there. The Reliability of the Gospels. So there's a lot of different books that you can get. I do recommend that one by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas first, because the resurrection is the most important thing. And if we can know that the resurrection happened, then we should be Christian, because that's what separates us from every other religion, right? I'm like, Muslims don't even believe Jesus was crucified. Okay.
Right.
I just watched a debate earlier today, 2 Muslims versus 2 Christians. And the Muslims were debating that Jesus wasn't even crucified. And so it's like, if we can argue for the resurrection, you shouldn't be a Muslim. You shouldn't be a Jewish person, because that's what vindicates him as the Messiah, right? Like Jews should become Christian because, hey, your Messiah has come. Become Christian, right? Or at least be a Messianic Jew, as they call themselves, right? You shouldn't be. I guess like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses believe the resurrection, so you'll need a little bit more to deal with them. But for the most part, like Hindus, Buddhists, like atheists, pretty much every worldview can be defeated by the resurrection of Jesus, right? And then you just need a little bit more to deal with Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. But it's like be able to defend the resurrection, and then study a little bit of Jehovah's Witness and Mormon theology, and you'll get the rest of it out, and then you'll be good.
And then, I mean, because you brought it up, I had this question where we were going. Do you know why? Because I haven't seen it, and maybe it exists out there. I feel like the reliability argument is uniquely thrown at Christians, and specifically the Gospels. Like, I don't see a lot of debates about the reliabilities of the Quran, or I don't see really a lot of debates. There are probably more debates about the Old Testament than the Quran. But can you speak into that a little bit? Why is it like, why does the Quran or Muslims get off the hook when it comes to reliability? I could be wrong. It could be my own perspective. I just don't see the debates, but I feel like it's way more common with the Gospels.
Well, to be frank with you, Muslim countries do not allow you to question Islam. Just to put it as bluntly as possible. Like, if you are a Muslim and you leave Islam, you get the death penalty. Okay. So the Quran isn't questioned in Muslim countries because it's not allowed to be, just to be as blunt as possible. In Christian countries, we allow freedom of speech. We allow freedom of religion. So, and obviously Christianity is the predominant religion in the West. And so Christianity, because of just where we live, we're going to be the most scrutinized. I would also say it's because Satan hates Jesus, and, you know, he's going to be, I think there are dark forces in the world also playing a part in it. But Also, on an academic level, to be frank with you, the Quran is not taken seriously. There are a lot of problems in the Quran that basically make scholars like, yeah, this book is like ridiculous. Just a couple of examples. The Quran claims that sperm is made in like the rib cage or the spine or something like this.
Yeah, I think it's the spine. Yeah,
it's like
It's weird.
that's just not true. There was another claim where it says like the sun sets into a pool of water because you know how like when the sun's far away, it kind of looks like, or when you're driving down the road, it kind of looks like water's ahead of you. Like they basically believed the sun set into water because of that. And there are a few other things. And again, they don't believe that Jesus was crucified. And that's probably the most established fact of the ancient world. Like if you don't believe Jesus was crucified, at least, you don't believe anything in history, because that's like the most verifiable fact there is. It's attested in secular sources, Roman sources, Jewish sources, Christian sources. It's like everywhere you look, Jesus was crucified. And so it's like, if you can't know that, you can't know anything. And so because of that, people just don't take the Quran seriously in academic circles, because it's like they reject like the most basic fact of the ancient world. Also because it's like one source, right? It's like one guy basically saying, this is revelation from God. Trust me, bro. And that's not what the Bible's like. The Bible has 40 different authors writing over 1,500 years. And, or I would say about 1,200. I think the Exodus was like in the 1,200s. But anyways, 1,200s BC. But either way, it was written over a long period of time. It's consistent. We have multiple attestation for events like in the Gospels to Jesus' resurrection. The Quran doesn't have any of that because it's one source. So you can't even verify a lot of its claims. It's just like one guy saying it, and it's like, that's it. And it's claimed nowhere else. And so it's hard for even historians to test the claims, because it's like, okay, we got this one guy saying this. Cool story, bro. Like that's basically how it goes, because historians want multiple attestation. They want to see like multiple independent things claiming the same thing. And for the Quran, that's just not there because Muhammad basically had the whole thing written for him. So yeah, that in summary, it's really just because the Quran isn't taken very seriously in academic circles. It also refutes itself. That's another thing. It like basically says, hey, Christians, follow the gospel. And it's like, well, if we do that, I won't be Muslim because you guys don't believe Jesus was crucified. So it's like it refutes itself. So, I mean, there's a lot of problems with it.
Yeah. There was something you were saying with in terms of the internal evidence of how fiction writers don't write in the way that the gospel writers did. When you're talking about fiction writers, are you saying you're saying historical fiction writers, correct? Are there some examples you could give? And modern, of course. Yeah,
all of them. So I can't tell you names off the top of my head of ancient ones because their names are all so weird. You know, if I need to memorize some, that is a good that would be a good thing to have memorized off the top of my head. But if you watch, Aspiring Philosophy had a video where he talked about how the name argument that I mentioned, where the Gospels have onomastic congruence with the names in the first century. Watch his video, and he gives comparisons, and you'll see some of those examples. So just to point people to a resource. But the reason I say that is because if you remember with the example of like, why did Jesus ask Philip for bread? It's like, do we really want people to think like Luke preempted John to, in two different contexts, set this up, and then John's like, all right, if my readers go read Luke, like this is going to be sick that I asked Philip, you know, like it's just not, fiction writers don't do this. Fiction writers, they want everything to be in the story, and they want to make their story foolproof. Think about every time you've lied, right? Because we've all done it. You think of every alibi, you think of every way that you could get caught. You're going to cover your tracks. Like every detail you give is intentional. Okay. And the gospel authors are just not writing like that. Again, it's like, you expect me to go read Luke and then pick up on all these different things. And then with the unnecessary details, like you expect me to just go verify that these people were crushed by a tower or something, and you don't mention it at all, or for artless similarities, like the characters being the same. Like, did John again expect me to go read Luke and verify, like, hey, by the way, Mary and Martha, they look pretty similar, don't they? Like, this is just not how fiction writers write. So that's what I mean by that, is like they I used to say it this way. I said that fiction writers don't write this way, and they don't lie this way. That's what it was. They don't write this way, and they don't lie this way. And so, like, when people lie, again, they're going to cover their tracks. And kind of like I said in that slide of unnecessary details, like when you're lying and you give an unnecessary detail, it's to make yourself appear more honest. And that is just not what they're doing when they're leaving unnecessary details. And so what that tells you is these guys are trying to just tell the truth. They're trying to tell you the way they remember it. They're trying to tell you the way things happened. If you remember in the Muratorian fragment slide, it said John told everybody, he's like, let's fast and let's remember everything that happened and let's write it down. And so it's like, that's basically what we see in the Gospels. They're just writing stuff down that they remember. They're like, oh yeah, remember that debate about purification with the Jews? Like, write that down. And then Jesus baptized. Like, we were talking about purification, right? It seems like they just didn't remember what it was about or any of the specific words, but you could imagine Andrew being like, remember we were like debating about purification, and then we pointed out Jesus was baptizing people. Oh yeah, write that down. And it's just like, it has nothing to do with the story. It has nothing to do with the life, ministry, death, resurrection of Jesus. It doesn't make you believe the story anymore, but it has this casual nature that makes it seem like, that's probably how it happened. They were just like, oh, remember that time we did this? And they wrote it down. And so it just makes it appear more honest. So
I think like a big skeptic argument could be like, let's say we take for granted all of the points about the gospel reliability. Like, yeah, some people in that Jewish context wrote it. We can see that. They take all that for granted, and then they say, well, I feel like this could be like a Matt Dillahunty argument that I'm just hearing.
No.
Like, take it for granted all of this. We take for granted all these things, but none of that gets you any closer to like the truth of the claims that are in there. And so maybe speaking to that a little bit, like all of the Gospels could be reliable documents, but what they're saying could still be falsehoods. Can you speak into that maybe skeptical claim?
Sure. Okay. So here's one argument I love, because when I hear people respond specifically to the Paleyan arguments, it's just like so funny, because they want you to believe that they got all these small details right, but then they are lying about the big stuff, right? Like, think about it.
Yeah.
They're going to get right that Bethsaida used to be a city, or used to be a village, and now it's a city. But then they're going to lie about Jesus rising from the dead, which is the entire point they're writing, by the way. They're going to go through the pains of, Luke is going to go through the pains of telling you, like, this happened in the 15th year in the reign of Tiberius, and we went to this exact city, and like it was during this exact day of the week, and it was during this feast, and then they're lying about and we can verify these things through other undesigned coincidences. Like, for example, Mark says that at the feeding of the 5,000, they sat down in green grass. And then in John, it says it was around the time of Passover. Guess what? That's the only time of year that the grass is green there. Okay, so you're going to tell me that Mark is going to go through the pains of telling you, oh, by the way, the grass was green, but I'm lying about the miracle. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, it just strains credulity beyond comprehension. And people like Dillahunty, because there are a lot of people that have kind of taken to his approach of just like, if you can't empirically demonstrate this, I won't believe, right?
Yeah.
You haven't
empirically demonstrate it today. Like, you can't point to it. You have to, it has to literally happen at this moment.
Which is just a category error, right? It's like, we're talking about a historical event that you're just asking for something that is literally ridiculous, right? Because when we're talking about a historical event, we're dealing in probabilities, not proofs. Historians don't
Mhm.
deal in proofs, especially before cameras existed. Like, we can prove that like 2 planes hit the Twin Towers, like to give a dark example, because it's on camera. Right. We can prove that, there certain robberies happen at a gas station because you see the person walk in on the camera and do what he does and whatever, right? Before cameras existed, nothing like that exists. It's just what happens in the moment happens, and then the moment's gone, and you can't prove it. But what you can see is the effects of what happened, right? So, for example, if when Peter cut off the ear of the soldier, right? It's like we have a cut off ear. We see the effect of what Peter did, but no one can prove it was Peter. Like, if someone 5 minutes later was like, prove that Peter did that. What do you mean? Like, you can't. We have a guy with a cut off ear, but that's it, right? And so, well, in John, Jesus heals it. But either way, it's like the effects were there for a moment. And so in the same way, when it comes to the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus, we can't prove historical events, but what we can show is the effects of what happened. Okay. And we can analyze the effects and analyze the movement that it began. And we can see that this Jewish sect of people went from basically following this man who was crucified and then proclaiming he's the Messiah. And here, these are some external facts from outside the Bible that are really interesting. So before the time of Jesus, the word resurrection it was not received the way it is today. Excuse me. So basically, for the Jewish people, they believed there was one resurrection at the end of the world. Basically, they believed when everyone died, they just go to their grave and they stay there until the resurrection at the end of the world. Mm-hmm. For Greeks, they did not believe in resurrection. Okay. They thought it was ridiculous to even talk about. They're like, that's stupid. Like, we're not going to talk about that. And so when you think about the time period and what they thought about resurrection, and then you look at what happened after Jesus' ministry, you've got a sect of Jews where their leader was killed. And now they're saying, he rose from the dead and he's the Messiah. What happened that caused that? There has to be some cause towards that effect. And you can't say they're lying because they were killed for claiming it, right? They went to their graves proclaiming it. People don't die for a lie. So they at least believed it. What's the cause of their belief? We have to answer that question as historians. You can't just say, prove it, bro. We have historical facts. Jesus was crucified again. That's the most verifiable fact in ancient history. And then we know his followers went to their graves proclaiming he rose. What the heck is the cause of that? And also we know N.T. Wright in this book, again, Resurrection of the Son of God, he shows that around the time of Jesus, there were like 12 to like 20 other movements, kind of like Jesus, where like they thought he was the Messiah. And then the leader was killed and the movements are never heard from again. So Jesus, he's a Messiah movement, or a messianic movement is the more technical way of saying it. And then he's killed and the movement doesn't stop. That's a verifiable fact. Christians exist right now. So there's your proof, Mr. Dillahunty. What happened? Why didn't they stop? Not only did they not stop, they said he's the Messiah. And you can see that because in their writings, he's called the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what happened, my dude? Like, we have with historians, what we do is we look at, and I say we like I'm a historian, but I study a lot of history. So what we do is we look at the effects of something, and then we say, what is a cause that could have produced that effect? What has the explanatory power, the explanatory scope? What is the least ad hoc? What is the simplest explanation? And we try to come to the best explanation. And when you look at all these facts, it's like, what better explanation is there other than what they claimed? Because if you asked them, why did you not stop following this man after he was crucified? They all would have told you because his tomb was empty and he appeared to us alive. What better explanation is there than that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, on
Dillahunty
this,
would say, well, I don't know, bro.
Yeah,
I don't know,
he said,
bro.
I
It doesn't
don't.
get me any
I don't
closer.
know. How,
Just prove it.
I don't
Yeah,
know, and I
prove it.
know you don't know. How do you know that I don't know? I don't know that you don't know.
Prove it, bro.
Stupid.
I'm not convinced. That's. I'll just say this:
Strange.
if anyone is like that, this is what I have to say to you. It's really easy to play skeptic. Try to convince me of anything, and I can say, "Prove it, bro." I'm not convinced. Give me more evidence. Oh, that's not evidence. How easy is that? Like you're just playing the easy way out. It's a total cop out. Like, come on, dude. Like let's actually defend a position, and let's like stop playing games here. That kind of approach is really obnoxious to me because it's like people who want to be taken seriously academically. It's like defend a position. Don't just sit there and say I'm not convinced. Like actually defend a position. Like explain the facts for me, bro. Give me a better explanation. And if you can't, then you should at least say that my position is reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least. And at most, you should become a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's the hope.
that's my appeal to Matt Dillahunty. So you can clip that and tag him.
Yeah.
That's for you,
Wow.
Dillahunty.
I guess another. I want to say it's almost like it's like a version of the ultimate skeptic, but it comes more from like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, how they're kind of popularizing this idea of like the Gospels are true and the disciples did believe they saw Jesus rise, but they were all potheads. Like they were just on drugs. And so they wrote about their experiences on drugs.
Yeah.
I'll just tell you, Nathan, there's nothing more frustrating to me than cultural Christianity as a movement right now. And I know that there's people that would disagree with me. It's just super frustrating to me how it's on the rise, and it annoys me. So sorry if I look annoyed.
Some background to this question. Our first interview was with a guy named P.F. Jung, who believes this, because he's a big Jordan Peterson guy, big on Joe Rogan, I believe, as well. He gave us this question. I just didn't think it was actually something people literally believed, I guess.
We got owned. Because we were
I was not prepped for that question at all, because I was like, I have never heard anybody actually admit to truly believing this.
Yeah. So he believed that they were basically tripping?
Yeah.
On what? Like
some shrooms, some really powerful shrooms.
Peterson and Joe Rogan on
the same guys that were preaching to be sober-minded at all times and to like avoid drunkenness, like those guys.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting theory.
He turned water into wine, but he didn't do anything with the shrooms, so it's still a possibility there.
I don't know. It's like Peter says, like, stay sober-minded, like the enemy's always prowling like a roaring lion. Paul says to stay sober-minded. Jesus, he was very clear about being righteous, living a holy life and obeying his commandments. And I don't find that plausible, guys. I'm going to be honest. I think it's like these guys, because you have to think too. So there have been some studies done about reasons why people start movements. And a lot of times for people, it's about power, it's about money, and it's about sex. Like if you look at a lot of cult movements, it's like one guy that just sleeps around with everybody in the cult, and he tells people like, I got revelation from God, and it's like, I need to sleep with your wife. And it's like, all right, dude, come on. Like, and it's literally like,
I want to say like edgy. That just sounds like Mormonism to me. I know that's edgy. Sorry, dude. Mormons, but I'm sorry.
True.
So that's pretty much what cults sound like, right? But you have to ask the question. The disciples did not look for money, sex, or power. They, like Paul is, sometimes it's like, again, I don't want to use the word annoying because it's the Bible, but he goes out of his way to be like, I didn't ask you guys for money. I didn't ask you guys for anything. I worked the whole time I was with you. I was making tents every day so I wouldn't have to take money from you. Like he's like explicitly telling these people. And again, he's writing to real people. So he's not making this up, right? He's writing letters to churches. And so if he was lying about that, they'd be like, oh, throw this out. He's being dishonest. So like, he's not getting money. They're not getting power. They didn't again, Paul was thrown in prison over and over again. he's not sleeping around. In fact, he says in his letters, like, hey, by the way, like, I'm celibate and I'm going to stay that way. You should be like me if you want to just fully dedicate yourself to God. And it's like, does it sound like they're starting some kind of cultic movement for power here? Like, it doesn't, right? So I think when you keep the motivations in mind too, it just makes all these alternative theories so ridiculous. You know, it's like they're not looking for power, sex, or money, which is what people who are lying or making up something are doing. They do it for those reasons. And that's not what the apostles did. They were just like, hey, our Messiah rose from the dead. Here are his teachings, and wait on him to return. He's coming back. So,
I have one more question. Josh, do you have another one?
No, I think that's good. We can. Well, and it better be a good. If it's not a good one, then maybe I'll have one. But you got to end on a good one.
Well, I hope it's good. I've seen this argument my entire Christian life online. You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible, which goes against your entire argument for internal evidence.
Oh yeah.
What do you say to refute that?
I love this question because I agree with it in a certain, in a very specific meaning. So here's what I mean by that. You should not prove the Bible by assuming the Bible's true. Okay. Like, none of my arguments assume that the Bible is the word of God. That's very important to understand. So for my arguments, like unexplained delusions, I'm not assuming the Bible is the word of God. I'm just showing you, like, hey, this is not how fiction writers write. This is way more plausible that it's just guys telling you what happened. Or like undesigned coincidences. I'm not assuming the Bible is the word of God. I'm showing you, like, hey, these guys are corroborating details in other gospels. That seems way more likely if this is eyewitness testimony. Like, any other hypothesis can't explain that. Or artless similarities. The characters are very consistent across multiple different episodes in multiple different contexts by independent authors. That's best explained by the fact that they're referring to real people with these real personalities. This is not assuming the Bible is the word of God. And so Paley, and that's why I love the Paleyan arguments. He's using the Bible to prove the Bible, but not in a sense that he's assuming the Bible's true, because that's just circular reasoning, right? That's begging the question. We should not do that. I agree. Christians should not reason in a circle. I should not say, of course Jesus is God. Have you read John chapter 1? Like, it's obvious, you know, like, unless you're talking to a Christian, right? If you're talking to someone who's like a Christian, but they're like, I don't know if Jesus is God, then okay, let's assume the Bible's true and let's read it, right? But if you're talking to an atheist, don't do that, right? And that's why I love, again, this book by Lacona for the Resurrection. They do not assume the Bible is the word of God. This whole argument is like, we're not assuming the Bible is the word of God. Here's a case for the resurrection without assuming that. And they give you the minimal facts. They give you facts that even atheist historians and skeptics and scholars will admit is true. And they take the facts that even skeptics and atheists will agree with, and then they'll make a case for the resurrection based only on those facts. And it's like, okay, it's like, even if you just look at atheist scholars, I can still give you a case for the resurrection. Like, that's basically what they're saying. And so all that to say, well, I should be a little bit more careful with the way I say that, because they do ask Christian scholars too. So they're basically saying, if you ask all scholars, atheists, skeptics, Christians, all scholars of all stripes, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, that are New Testament scholars, these are the facts that have over 90% checks, like, yeah, that happened. And then they build a case for the resurrection based on just those facts. So that's a more like detailed way of saying their argument. But all that to say, they're not assuming the Bible is the word of God. And so in a very particular sense, yeah, we should not use the Bible to prove the Bible. And what I mean by that is, do not assume the Bible's true to prove that the Bible's true. That's circular reasoning. However, if you look at Paley's arguments, if you look at Lacona's arguments and Gary Habermas's arguments, and you say, okay, what can we get from the Bible without assuming it's the word of God? And then let's build a case from there. You can use the Bible to prove the Bible. And again, I mean, like we said with the prophecies in the Old Testament, like, we see there's this prophecy in the Old Testament, and then we notice again there's the Dead Sea Scrolls that have the Great Isaiah Scroll. we can prove from the Bible, okay, that's a prophecy, right? But I don't do that by assuming that it's prophecy and then assuming that it was the word of God from the beginning. We do this by pointing to something outside of it, like, hey, this archaeological discovery shows me that this prediction was made before Jesus' life. Now I can say it's a prophecy. I didn't assume it was a prophecy. I showed you it was. So that's how we should approach this.
I guess I do have one more question going off of that.
Sure.
You brought it to my mind. This is something that I've seen a lot of people bring up against people like Inspiring Philosophy, who use a lot of secular like findings and arguments to build a case for the resurrection or for Christ, or just the Bible. They bring up the fact that all of these secularists who we use their evidence, the evidence of them, they don't agree with our conclusion. Is there a way to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the important thing to note is that there are scholars of like all different religions and backgrounds that study the Bible. The Bible is the most criticized book in the world by far. It is not close. And so you also have to know that people are not logic machines. Okay. We are motivated by emotions, even if we don't want to admit that. We are motivated by things. There are things that we want to be true, right? Like, I'll put my biases on the table. I want Christianity to be true. I think it's the best news ever. Okay. So someone might say that, oh, well, you're biased. I shouldn't listen to anything you have to say. That's poisoning the well, first of all. That's fallacious. You should judge our arguments based on their merits. Okay. And so what you want to do is look at the skeptics' arguments for why they reject us. Why do you reject my conclusion, Mr. Ehrman? Why do you reject my conclusion? Dale Allison, and when you go down the list of all the skeptic scholars, well, Dale Allison, he's not a skeptic. I'd say he's a pretty fair scholar, but I think he's a little bit too careful. He's like, he really doesn't want to grant that much, but either way, he's pretty fair for most people. He's considered very objective. But what you want to do is you want to look at their arguments. And if their arguments are bad, then you can know that their conclusion's wrong. Okay, so for example, Bart Ehrman will say things like, oh, well, Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, it seems like he's surprised that he's dying on the cross. And like, he has this talk where he'll say stuff like that. He says, oh God, my God, why have you forsaken me? It seems like he's surprised, right? But obviously we know that's a quote of Psalm 22. And he's actually, and the Psalms, by the way, are like the songs of the Jewish people. So if I were to be like, let's see, shot through the heart,
and you're to blame.
That's basically what he's doing, right?
Yeah.
He's doing that with the Psalms. Like, he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Jews around him would have immediately thought, oh, that's Psalm 22. And what is Psalm 22? It's a messianic prophecy. That's the first line of Psalm 22. If you read through Psalm 22, he's basically saying, this is being fulfilled in front of you. Like, I'm right here. My hands are spread out. My hands are pierced. There are people mocking me. Like, all of this is in Psalm 22, right? He's basically like starting off the song and saying, this is being fulfilled in front of you. So first of all, his exegesis of that passage is just ridiculous. But second of all, if you read the Gospel of Mark, he literally predicts that he's going to be killed. Like, he's not surprised at all. So so when you hear his argument, it's like, oh, this makes it seem like it's anonymous or whatever. And then you realize, like, well, that argument is dumb. Okay, you should reject his conclusion, right? But then when you hear what I just said, that's much more plausible. He predicted he would die, and he's literally quoting a psalm that is messianic, that talks about him being pierced in his hands and feet, I believe, as well. It's talking about people mocking him and all this stuff. Like, it's very obvious what's happening in the psalm and in Mark. And so I think what we have to do is we have to analyze the reasons that are given to see the conclusion we come to, because there are scholars, like I said, of every belief system. And so if someone says, oh, well, atheist scholars disagree with you, so Christian scholars agree with me. You know, if you're going to disagree with people because a certain kind of scholar disagrees with someone, I just don't think you're thinking about what scholarship is. You know, there are Muslim scholars who are New Testament scholars. They're Muslims, but they're New Testament scholars, right? It's like, I don't know how, but they are. And they have specific readings they're looking for and their conclusions they come to. And that's just the way it is. So, and I do want to say this too. Scholars are not like infallible arbiters of truth. I have heard some of the most ridiculous arguments in my entire life from scholars. Like, genuinely. And I don't mean to be insulting, but I can't think of a nice way to say it. Some of the dumbest things I've ever heard have come out of the mouths of scholars, and it just needs to be said. And so just because someone says, oh, this person's a scholar, that does not mean they're right. And so we have to, and again, there is great scholarship out there. I mean, you see the scholarly works behind me. There is good scholarship out there. I'm not mocking all scholars. I think, like I said, Michael Lacona's newest book, Jesus Contradicted, some of the best work I've read in a long time. It's amazing stuff. But again, some stuff I hear from scholars, it's like, what are you even saying, man? Like, he's surprised he's being crucified. Like, really, Bart? Like, seriously, it's not serious. It's not serious. And so that's another thing to say is, like, don't be intimidated by the word scholar, because there are scholars that disagree with Bart Ehrman. There are scholars that think his arguments are ridiculous. Like, I'm not a scholar, but I think his arguments are ridiculous, you know? And a lot of times they'll create contradictions out of thin air. It's like, I don't know why atheists don't believe in creation ex nihilo, because they do it all the time with contradictions. It's like they create contradictions ex nihilo. It's crazy to me. And that means out of nothing, by the way. So they invent contradictions out of text that it's just like, what are you saying, dude? Like, I watched a video by Paleyan recently where he was talking about the letters of Paul. And he was saying that in one of his letters, he talks about the church in one way. And then in this letter, he talks about the church in another way. And then you read the two verses and it's like, those statements don't contradict at all. Like, in one sentence, he's saying, like, you know, listen to your elders. And then in another sense, he's saying, like, gather with your congregation. And it's like, how is that contradictions, dude? It just doesn't make any sense. So, like, always test their claims. Like, that's the number one thing is, like, I believe God providentially made the world in such a way where truth has substance behind it and lies do not. And I really think that this is just at the core of my epistemology. It's like, truth always has substance behind it and lies don't. So whenever you're hearing someone come at a conclusion, if their conclusion is false, their arguments will always be bad. There will always be some sort of fallacy in there. There's always going to be some sort of maneuver they're pulling, some sort of sleight of hand. And they might not even be doing it intentionally. Like, they might actually believe what they're saying, but there is something going on that is false. And there's ultimately, it's empty. It's privation. It's just nothingness. However, with truth, I've just come to believe this, that truth always has substance behind it. The arguments will always be sounder. They're not going to have fallacies. They're going to be able to argue for their position much more coherently and cogently. And so I always just tell people, if they're even a scholar, if they disagree with you, look at their reasons. And I almost every time it turns out that I think the Christian scholars have better arguments, almost like basically universally, because they're not trying to avoid the conclusions of the Bible. They're just letting it speak for itself. They're letting the history say what it says. And a lot of times I feel like people who are trying to avoid that conclusion just like will not let it say what it says. And I really believe that we can rest in the truth of the scriptures. I mean, that you saw the evidence I brought tonight. It's like, and that's just the Gospels. Imagine if I could bring in the book of Acts too. I mean, the book of Acts is crazy how reliable it is. It's nuts. Like, actually. Luke was a genius. He was one of the best historians ever. And, I mean, the guy just got fact after fact after fact right. There was a scholar named Colin Hemmer. He wrote a book on the book of Acts, and he made a list of 84 facts that can be verified outside of the book of Acts. From archaeology, from writings, from outside the Bible. 84. Like, insane. So it's like when you see all the evidence for the Bible, it's just overwhelming. You see the prophecies that I mentioned earlier from the Old Testament. You see all this stuff for the Gospels. You see the book of Acts. And it's like we have such solid ground to stand on. And the arguments that come against us are going to be so weak in comparison. It's not even funny. So don't be scared of Bart Ehrman. Don't be scared of Paleyan. Don't be scared. I watch all their videos. I sit down. I love watching Myth Vision. Some of their arguments are so funny to me. I watch Kip Davis and Josh. I watch them all because I'm not scared of their arguments. I actually want to hear what they have to say. I want to hear the crap they're saying so that I can be prepared to argue against it. And we don't have to be scared of the skeptics, guys. And sometimes they're going to bring an argument that you haven't heard before, and you're not going to know how to answer it. And that's okay. There are answers because, trust me, scholars have heard, like Christian scholars have heard those arguments before, and they've dealt with them, right? So just find the right Christian scholar and read the responses, and you'll probably realize, like, oh, there is a really solid answer to that. Like every time I've had that happen where I'm like, oh man, he made a good point. I go read a Christian scholar that responds to it, and it's like, oh wow, okay, that wasn't that scary after all. So, So anyways, it's don't be afraid of the skeptics. They're wrong. We're right. And therefore their arguments are worse than ours. So
yeah, that's great. I want to thank you for coming on, Nathan, and joining the Bro Show as our esteemed guest and arbiter of wisdom. This was great, and is something I'm going to revisit. Revisit your presentation for arguments for the reliability of the Gospels, because I think it was a great synopsis. So thanks for breaking it down with us. For those of you watching, if you liked what you saw, we're going to be doing more streams like this, conversations like this. So give us a like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Just engage with our stuff. We'll be around, Seth and I having conversations like this.
Do all the YouTube things.
Sign up. Yeah, do all of the YouTube things. All of the YouTube things.
These guys have been great hosts. I just want to say thank you guys for having me. Seriously, y'all were great hosts. It's been really cool connecting with you. Subscribe, like all their stuff. Like, seriously, they're really great. And hope you guys are successful on your channel.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Likewise, subscribe to Nathan. He's a G for coming on. So, yes, Seth.
Before we close out, I know we haven't done this in a little while. I think we should pick it back up. We've had a couple of our guests end off by giving us like a quest to do or to search after.
The analogy is we're on our video game. Yeah, we're on a video game adventure, and we just started this online adventure, right? And so we've it was put that we've met a feudal lord on the road and has given us a quest. So you are another feudal lord that we are coming to as mere beggars. We have a couple tools, we got some gold, but we're on the way.
We're starting to level up a little bit. We're starting to level up.
Maybe level 2.
Yeah.
All right, let's go. Okay. Do you want like a real life quest, like something to do in the real world, or like a video game quest?
I would say keep it related to the online space. So like if there's a subject that you would love to us bring on, cover, or maybe even a direct person that you want us to reach out to. Where should we go?
I have a few friends that you could reach out to. One of my favorite channels is Darwin to Jesus. He's a good buddy of mine named Daniel. He gets a lot of DMs though. He's got like 20,000 followers on Twitter. He's a big account, so it might be a little bit hard to get in touch with him. But he would be a good one because he has some really funny arguments against atheism. I actually am going to have him on my channel sometime soon to talk about one of his arguments. I think it's the conclusion is hilarious. So I just have to talk about it. So, so he would probably be like the biggest channel. But if you're unable to get in touch with him, you guys already had Curious Christianity on, right?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Yeah,
He's one of my buddies. Who else would be like a good guest? So maybe I'll ask you guys this. Do you guys have are you guys like more non-denominational type Christian? Like what would you guys fall under? Like more?
Yeah, I mean, we come from a non-denominational evangelical background. We're open.
Okay.
We've had discussions on it.
Okay.
Yeah, we're really intrigued by historic Protestantism. I think both Seth and I are. So we kind of want to get into that space a little bit, ask questions about that too. So
yeah. Okay. So that was why I was asking. So there are a few Catholic and Protestant channels I would recommend. So for the Catholic side, I would say, because I'm a Protestant myself, but I'll recommend the Catholic side first. There's a channel called Since 33 AD or Since AD 33. I really like his stuff. I think he's probably the best Catholic apologist out there, in my opinion. So if you want to hear the Catholic side of things, go to him. If you want to hear a good Protestantism defenses, I would say the Other Paul is really good. I would say Gavin Ortland, if you could get in touch with him. Jordan Cooper, they're the best, in my opinion. Oh, man. There might be one or two others that I'm forgetting off the top of my head.
That's okay. This is good. We have targets. We're like bounty hunters now.
Yeah. We have a bunch of we have a list of contracts that we can just start hitting down.
Yeah,
I think so. This is good.
I think the ecumenical dialogues are fun. Now, I will tell you this though. Do not make a fast conversion to anything. I always tell people take time with it, guys. Like I was raised non-denominational too. So just to be frank with you, and I'm still non-denominational. I've been studying this stuff for about 2 or 3 years. I'm considering becoming Methodist, but I haven't made that jump yet. Like I recently got a bunch of Methodist books, like all the 5 books right there are all Methodist books. But so I'm considering becoming Methodist, but I will just say a lot of the claims of a lot of traditions are just not true. So when you really get into it, they make very bold claims and they don't have a lot of substance behind it. Kind of like I was saying with the atheists, like there's not a lot of substance there. And so you got to look past the rhetoric. A lot of times you'll hear the Catholics say for 1500 years, there were no Protestant beliefs in church history. And you just look at the fathers and it's like, well, that's false. And then, they're like apostolic succession is how you find a church. And it's like, well, that isn't exactly how that works. And, it's just their claims are so bold and they're just not true. So I actually find the Baptists have a strong, argument from church history that that churches are supposed to be led by a group of elders, right? That actually seems like what the early church was. And so low church Baptists, it's like, they have an actual church history argument, So I'll just say, if you start doing these types of conversations, don't convert quickly because you're going to hear a lot of rhetoric that's very strong. It can give you a lot of anxiety. It can make you feel like, oh, if I don't become this denomination, I'm going to not go to heaven, right? They're going to make you feel that way, but just seriously, and again, I do a lot of Protestant apologetics. If you guys do have problems with the Catholics, just reach out to me anytime. I got you.
All right, sounds good.
Catholicism is false. So,
all right, that sounds good. I do agree, but
yes, sir.
We will reach out to you once we remember that. Right. So, all right, thank you again for coming on. We will take these names and we will take these quests on in our journey of the internet. I'm gonna end the stream and we'll catch you all later.